Han Sen could feel two powers battling inside him, but even so, his facial expression remained unchanged. He had thought of a way to deal with the power invading his body some time ago. Instead of the unimaginably horrible force that Fox Queen considered it, Han Sen had realized that it was just power like any other. It wasn't too bad. Han Sen used his mind to summon Spell. She appeared in the form of a young lady. Han Sen was casting the Dongxian Sutra as hard as he could. At that moment, he couldn't spare a thought for anything else. Spell was sort of like a living being, and so she could cast the story of Jean alone. And she didn't require Han Sen's body for the control. Han Sen and Spell's minds were connected. She knew what Han Sen wanted, and so she cast the story of Jean's. One of her hands pressed against Han Sen's forehead. A symbol of light appeared on Han Sen's forehead, then melted into his flesh. At that instant, Han Sen's body stopped changing. It was like the sacred blood statue and the nine-tailed fox were frozen in place. Everything just stopped. But after a single second, the sacred blood statue and the nine-tailed fox started to move again. They raged through Han Sen's body just as they had before. Spell pulled out her pistols and fired at Han Senator. Each bullet was imbued with the powers of eternity, and they peppered across Han Sen's skin. They froze each part of Han Sen's body in turn. Han Sen ran his Dongxian Sutra at max power, and he started pushing it toward King class. The whole world was like a gigantic machine comprised of cogwheels, their teeth interlocked. And Han Sen's cogwheel was oversized. It had the rigidity of steel, and many surrounding cogwheels were too small to fit into it. Even so, it connected with many cogwheels. If he wanted to move his self-universe cogwheel, he would have to spin all the cogwheels around him as well. Han Sen pushed his Dongxian Sutra to run at an insane level. He tried to push the self-universe cogwheel using every scrap of strength he could gather, including the sacred blood statue and nine-tailed fox powers. Spell fired continuously, and most of Han Sen's body had been solidified. But that solidifying power wasn't enough to stop the sacred blood statue or nine-tailed fox markings. But Spell wasn't planning on keeping them trapped, anyway. Spell used Eternity's solidifying powers to forge a path inside Han Sen's body. It was the path that the Dongxian Sutra would take. Aside from that path, everything else would be frozen. Two scary powers were coming, surging into that tunnel like a raging river. With the guidance of Han Sen's Dongxian Sutra, the flow of power was headed directly for the self-universe cogwheel. Boom! The horrendous collection of powers hit the self-universe cogwheel. The cogwheel vibrated gently. It didn't spin, but Han Sen spotted the small seeds of hope. Han Sen had tried his hardest before this, but it had always proven fruitless. He had never been able to move the self-universe cogwheel the slightest amount. Now, after a single hit, it had reacted, if only barely. It gave him hope. He closed his eyes and continued casting the Dongxian Sutra. He guided the two powers into the cogwheel again and again. Every hit made the cogwheel jump. With the Dongxian Sutra guiding more and more power, the cogwheel shivering developed into a loud rattle. The cogwheels around it were also starting to move. It was like a machine that had been abandoned many years ago was now being reactivated. Dust fell away from the gears as the hum of a dormant power started to come to life. Spell's face was impassive as she kept shooting. She had to keep the tunnel in Han Sen's body intact. The flesh Eternity had solidified was somewhat like a dam. The sacred blood statue and nine-tailed fox markings were like flash floods. They followed the course of the river, washing up against the dam and banks that guided it. Those restraints could not be allowed to break. If they broke, the power would spill and spread, turning into a destructive force that could ruin Han Sen. Eternity's solidifying power was Duke class, so the dam wasn't enough to trap all the water. Spell had to keep solidifying the dams repeatedly so that they wouldn't crumble under the onslaught. Boom! 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 Han Sen kept hitting the self-universe cogwheel. The cogwheel spun little by little, but it only moved a small distance with each strike. When the hits stopped, the cogwheel stopped. My self-universe cogwheel is too big. I'm afraid that making it spin might be too difficult, Han Sen thought in surprise. The two powers kept colliding with the cogwheel, but they had proved insufficient to get the cogwheel moving continuously. This was a much harder task than Han Sen had believed it would be. Fortunately, Han Sen had chosen to break through with the Dongshin Sutra. He could see the self-universe cogwheel clearly, and that enabled him to strike with precision and at an angle that would deliver the most force. If he had chosen to use a different Geno art, he would barely be able to see his connection with the universe at large. Without being able to see the cogwheel, it would have been even harder for him to level up. These two powers are too spread out. If they keep hitting like this, it will be impossible to truly start up the self-universe cogwheel. After another moment, Han Sen came up with a solution. He thought about it in his mind, and Spell understood what he meant. Her pistol shifted slightly, changing the course of the tunnel she had crafted inside Han Sen's body. The two powers had been guided on different paths through Han Sen's body, but now they were brought together into a circle. That cycle of powers was then pushed into a new pair of trenches that interlocked in a figure eight, allowing the power to cycle continuously. As the powers cycled, they passed over Han Sen's self-universe cogwheel.
Gotcha.
When those two powers moved together in perfect unison, the chains that pulled the cogwheel started to move. The self-universe cogwheel started to move along with it. The other cogwheels that were connected to it started to spin, as well. Pure joy shot through Han's senator. He kept guiding the two powers to turn the cogwheel. It was slow going in the beginning, but as the cogwheel started to move, it also began to accelerate.
Gotcha.
When the cogwheel started to turn, Han Sen felt as if his entire body was waking up from the embrace of a deep slumber. It was like a generator had been started, and an endless power began to rise. As the cogwheel spun in a blur, Han Sen could see behind the cogwheel that light was growing brighter. The faster the cogwheel spun, the brighter that light became. Boom! With the sacred blood statue and nine-tailed fox power combining to form a chain, the self-universe cogwheel was given what was needed for it to spin on its own. Inside the cogwheel, the light was burning brighter than any sun. The light looked like it could melt anything. Han Sen's body felt as weightless as a feather, and the self-universe cogwheel no longer required his power. It could now run on its own. An invisible area opened. Expanding its radius outside of Han's senator, it created a weird, invisible bubble. Dongshin Battle Body has leveled up to King Class First Tier area. It worked. Han Sen grinned like a fiend. He had finally become King Class. Although he was only on the first tier, what was most important was the fact that he had succeeded. Han Sen wasn't surprised by the appearance of the door behind the cogwheels. Instead, he let himself be pulled through. This was a necessary part of the process of becoming a king. Whenever a king-class creature successfully kickstarted their self-universe cogwheel, they were given permission to enter the Geno universe core area. No one had ever been able to determine the exact nature of the core area. Some said that it was actually a special xenogeneic gene. Others claimed that it was a location within the Geno Hall. There were many other guesses, but no matter which theory was more popular at the moment, there was never any evidence to support one claim over another. For now, there was only one thing that everyone agreed on. The core area could be accessed through the self-universe cogwheel once someone ascended to King Class. When your cogwheel began spinning for the first time, you would be pulled into the universal core area. Just like Han Sen was being pulled in now, his body flew into the blinding light shining through the door, and when his vision returned, he found himself to be standing inside a palace built of some ancient metal. This palace was a strange patchwork structure. The entire place was composed of differently sized cogwheels. The walls, floors, and roof were all like this, and the wheels were fitted so tightly together that there were no visible seams. Every cogwheel was spinning at a different speed. Some moved so quickly that they blurred, whereas others were so slow that their movement was almost imperceptible. Rhythmic tick-tock sounds filled the palace, similar to the sounds that a mechanical watch might produce. Han Sen didn't have time for sightseeing, though, because his body was still hosting the powers of the sacred blood statue and the nine-tailed fox. Leveling up to King Class hadn't proved enough to destroy those energies. Han Sen suddenly decided to use the story of genes. He wanted to see if he could use the sacred blood statue and nine-tailed fox power to push the story of Gene's self-universe cogwheel. That was hoping for too much, though. The sacred blood statue and the nine-tailed fox's power wasn't enough to push the self-universe cogwheel of the story of genes. As Han Sen tried to use them, their powers subsided and eventually vanished. In the end, they disappeared. Han Sen checked out his own body, just to be sure, but he didn't find any trace of them within him. Then, he looked back at the palace. The cogwheels were in constant motion like the gears of a watch. But unlike a watch, the palace had no needles to tell time. Instead, there were just more teeth. The more teeth a cogwheel had, the slower it spun. The fewer teeth a cogwheel had, the faster it went. Watching the clocks was strangely mesmerizing, almost lulling. It was like being in a palace full of clocks. Han Sen's body was hanging in midair. When his feet touched a cogwheel on the floor, the cogwheel accelerated. The change in speed swept out through the connected cogwheels, and soon the entire palace was humming with greater energy. The dimension of the place was twisted disconcertingly. A few moments later, the door of the palace opened, revealing a starscape beyond. Han Sen's body was currently safely ensconced in his Dongxin armor. He walked out of the Universal Core Palace and looked up at the myriad of stars. Upon closer observation, however, he realized that what he had first taken for stars were actually scary king creatures. When Han Sen stepped out of the Universal Core Palace, the whirring sound of the palace's cogwheels disappeared. Han Sen knew he could summon the Universal Core Palace whenever he wanted by pushing his self-universe cogwheel. But this was the first time Han Sen had entered the Universal Core area, and he didn't want to leave yet. He wanted to look around for himself and see if this place was just as the legends described it. Suddenly, a light shot past Han Sen, vanishing behind him. Then it reappeared a while later, swinging around so it could head straight for him. Han Sen was suddenly worried. Entering the Universal Core area required at least king-class power, but deified elites could access this place as well. Han Sen was just a first-tier king, so he knew that he needed to be careful. The star came to a stop in front of Han's senator. Now that Han Sen could get a better look at it, he realized that it was Dragon 8 of the Dragon. He was king-class as well. Dolar. Dragon 8 looked at Han Sen with fiery eyes. When Han Sen joined the battles of the Geno Scroll, he fought as Dollar. There, he wore his Dongxin armor. Therefore, Han Sen rarely wore it when he wasn't using his Dollar identity. He didn't want to expose the fact that he and Dollar were the same person. After the Dongxin Sutra evolved twice, the Dongxin armor's appearance had changed radically. Now, the Dongxin armor was solid black, so dark that it lacked any semblance of light. Any light that landed on it would disappear instantly. If someone looked at Han Sen from afar, he would seem like a black shadow hanging in the air. Han Sen hadn't expected someone to recognize him as Dollar just because of the Dongxin armor. Since he was recognized, though, Han Sen made no effort to deny the claim. He looked at Dragon 8 and said, "Dragon 8? You remember me? Good." The fire of insanity in Dragon 8's eyes blazed even higher. He had lost to Dollar in one of the Geno Scroll battles. He hadn't gotten over his loss, and he had been researching better ways to fight Dollar ever since. But he had been unable to find Dollar. He didn't expect to find him there, of all places. He opened his gold area and doused Han Sen in the light. With an arrogant smirk, he said, "This time, I am going to beat you. Release your area." "Dragon 8, what are you doing?" As Han Sen answered, a few more lights arrived. They were kings of the dragon. Han Sen even identified one of them as Dragon 1. Han Sen was shocked. Dragon 1 must have been half deified by now, and he wasn't the only powerful dragon who had come. If they all attacked Han Sen together, things would definitely go badly for him. "Big Dragon, he is Dollar." Dragon 8 snarled, still staring at Han Sen. "Dollar?" asked Dragon 1 and the others in surprise. Dollar's performance in the Geno Scroll had been truly remarkable, even to them. But Dollar hadn't become an obsession for them the way he had for Dragon 8. And they hadn't been able to recognize him, initially. After a while, though, they started to believe the claim. "You really are Dollar?" Dragon 1 asked Han Sen uncertainly. "So what? Does it matter if I am or not?"
Han Sen responded smoothly.
"I know that I'm right. He is Dollar. The rest of you need to stay back, because he is mine." Dragon 8 bared his teeth in a rictus grin. "Dollar, open your area. Let me see if you are as strong as you were before." "That is unnecessary," Han Sen said. gathering power in his finger as he spoke. He sent a coin flying toward Dragon 8. "Don't ever underestimate me," Dragon 8 shouted, and his gold area became solid. It transformed into an old golden chest, trapping the coin inside it.
Yong.
The golden chest fell under the power of the coin, but it didn't draw closer to Dragon 8. What a powerful metal area! Han Sen complimented his opponent. Dragon 8's area allowed him to generate metal and make things solid. If Dragon 8 wanted to, he could seal Han Sen within the golden area. It was similar to Nine-Headed Bird's coffin suppression, but Dragon 8's area wasn't just for sealing foes. "Dolar, I will defeat you today." After that declaration, a punch came right for Han's senator cloaked in Dragon 8's Gold King area. The enormous power of that punch became a roaring gold dragon, ready to consume Han Sen. "Let me try my Dongxian area power," Han Sen thought, his heart leaping. He opened his invisible Dongxian area, and all of a sudden, the whole world around Han Sen was now composed of an infinite number of spinning cogwheels. Han Sen could see his opponent's draconic punch and area power. They came from Dragon 8's self-universe cogwheel, which exerted force on some universal cogwheels around it to generate more power. Within the radius of the Dongxian area, Han Sen could feel Dragon 8's ability to affect the universal cogwheels. The Dongxian area could affect them, too. Han Sen lifted his hand and focused his mind. When Han Sen pushed forward, it wasn't to affect Dragon 8. Instead, he used his Dongxian area to control the nearby cogwheels that were in motion. The universal cogwheels that had been under Dragon 8's control suddenly came to a complete stop. In that instant, something unbelievable happened. Dragon 8's Gold King area and Dragon Punch lost their power. It was an oddly embarrassing moment for Dragon 8. It was like an actor filming a special effects-based fight scene. The fight looked amazing with the special effects, but halfway through the video, the special effects had vanished. Dragon 8 was left hanging awkwardly in the air. A cruel punch had been sent toward Han Sen, but when the power in the attack vanished, Dragon 8's actual fist was still 100 meters away from Han Sen, and so nothing happened. Dragon 8 couldn't believe his eyes, and so he threw another punch. No power was produced.
No.
"This is impossible. Why can't I use my area and my power?" Dragon 8 stared at Han Sen, stupefied. Dragon 1 and the other Dragon Kings were similarly dumbfounded. They couldn't see the invisible Dongxian area. They had simply seen Han Sen wave his hand, and then Dragon 8's area and power vanished. It was very scary. Han Sen was pleased beyond words. The Dongxian area could control every universal cogwheel in its radius. That meant that unless the enemy was stronger than Han Sen could easily control his every cogwheel. Any power that came into contact with the Dongxian area would be dismissed. Of course, if the enemy was stronger than Han Sen and kept using their power to push against the cogwheels Han Sen was trying to gain control of, the Dongxian area wouldn't work as well. But even if the enemy's power was stronger than Han Sen's, the Dongxian area could still be quite effective. It could make the cogwheels spin slower, at least. It could even make a cogwheel accelerate, if there was cause for that. Ordinary area powers could only affect the universal cogwheels that immediately connected to the self-universe cogwheel, but the Dongxian area could affect all of the cogwheels within its radius. That was why the Dongxian area was so scary. And it didn't simply destroy the power that the enemy had attempted to wield. It had an additional function. Han Sen lifted his fist and threw a punch toward Dragon 8, who was still thoroughly dazed from the disappearance of his attack. A giant metal dragon launched from Han Sen's fist and thundered toward Dragon 8, mouth open. It was just like the punch Dragon 8 himself had tried to deliver. Han Sen had seen how the punch affected the universal cogwheels, so in order to simulate the punch, he just had to replicate the movement of the cogwheels. The simulation wasn't exactly the same, because the energy of the punch originated from Han Sen's self-universe cogwheel instead of Dragon 8's. That meant that the core power of the attack was different. Pang! A gold dragon punch? How is that possible? Dragon 8 was frozen, and so he forgot to dodge. The blow sent him flying, blood spraying from his mouth in a long stream. For Dragon 1 and the others, their surprise was turning into horror. That punch was Dragon 8's own skill merged with a dragon secret called the Dragon Punch technique. It was a unique skill, but Han Sen had copied it, and turned it back on his opponent in seconds. That was terrifying. No wonder you were called the universe's #1 marquise. Even at king class, you are still this strong, Dragon 1 said to Han Sen as he picked up the injured Dragon 8. I am flattered. If there's nothing else to be done here, I will take my leave, Han Sen said, and then turned to leave. Dragon 1 raised his hand and stopped Han Senator, he said. We found some core xenogeneics. 2 of them are half deified. Are you interested? How would the resources be split? Han Sen asked Dragon 1. The universal core area had many core xenogeneics. They were king class at the very least, but the xenogeneic genes they yielded were very special. Core genes could provide a powerful boost to one's king area. Many kings sought those core genes in order to level up their area. Han Sen was interested. There were 9 tiers he needed to climb, and then he would need to reset after that. Currently, Han Sen was only on the first tier. Climbing the levels one by one would be a difficult thing to do. If he could level up using core xenogeneic genes, it would be much easier. It is a very large group of core xenogeneics, Dragon 1 said. Those 2 half-deified xenogeneics are very scary. I can deal with one, but I cannot take down 2. If you can keep one busy, I will give you 50% of the reward. Boss, isn't 50% a bit too much? A king dragon quickly said. Dragon 1 waved his hand. It isn't too much. No one else among us can kite the other half-deified core xenogeneic. We have no chance of killing the group without that being done, though. Either we make this deal, or none of us get anything. He would deserve 50%. Dragon 1 turned back to Han Sr. What do you think? It sounds good, as long as I'm only kiting that one half-deified xenogeneic. Let's go get it done, then, Han Sen answered, accepting their terms. This was his first time inside the universal core area, so he wasn't really familiar with the place. Hanging out with the dragons wasn't a bad start. It's a deal. Dragon 1 quickly agreed and signed a contract with Han Sen. Together, they all flew into the sky. As they traveled, Dragon 8 asked, Dollar, what tier have you reached? Dragon 1 and the others all perked up their ears to listen. They had been curious about this since they saw him fight. With Han Sen's performance, they were guessing that he had to be at least 5th tier. Some suspected he was 9th tier. Otherwise, how could he have destroyed Dragon 8 as he had? Tier 1. Han Sen didn't feel the need to hide his rank. After all, they would have to fight together. If he used his king area for a long time, it might become apparent that he only had a single tier. Lying about it now would serve no purpose. Upon hearing Han Sen's answer, Dragon 8 jerked in the air as if he had hit a patch of turbulence. His face had gone slack. You're a 1st-tier king? Dragon 1 and the others looked at Han Sen, trying to keep their expressions neutral. After that, they didn't want to talk anymore. This was the first time Han Sen had seen a core xenogeneic. They looked like a group of insects, all of them with wings. The bodies were humanoid. They had 4 limbs, but their heads were unusually small. They were 1.5 meters tall, and their whole bodies were shelled in an aqua blue material. Their shells were so smooth and glossy that Han Sen could see his reflection in them. A pair of blue transparent wings sprouted from each bug's back. When the bugs flew, their wings moved so fast that they turned into a blur. They didn't appear to be too different from average xenogeneics. Their most outstanding feature was the fact that they were all king class. As far as Han Sen could tell, their high rank and the fact that everyone called them core xenogeneics was the only thing that made them unique. Han Sen made a quick calculation. There were 100 core xenogeneics ahead, and they were all king class. That amount was a rare sight. Dragon 1 pointed out 2 xenogeneics within the horde of bugs and said, those 2 are the half-deifieds of this bug enclave. You and I can take one each. Dragon 8 and the others can deal with the rest. I will kill one half-deified xenogeneic, then help you take care of the other. Dragon 1 didn't expect Han Sen to have the chops to kill a half-deified creature. After all, he was only a 1st-tier king. Okay. Han Sen nodded, then turned the 2 bugs Dragon 1 had pointed out. The bodies of those 2 half-deifieds looked quite similar to those of the other bugs, but their armor was purple-red. Their bodies were also laden with spikes. They were certainly a more intimidating sight. Following their plan, Han Sen and the others moved straight in to attack the group of insects. The space bugs soon noticed their approach, and the entire group released a collective scream. Then, the bugs hurried forward to meet with the invaders. Near the hearts of the space bugs, something that looked like small lanterns flared to life, giving off a green light. They were like small, cold, nuclear reactors. When Han Sen looked deeply into those lanterns, he could see a spot of light spinning around a core crystal. It was an oddly beautiful sight. Those must be their xenogenic cores, Han Sen thought. He was about to start drooling. They were King-class xenogenics. BZZD. As the cores of the space bugs lit up, they started to cast blue and green areas. Because there were many space bugs, and they were all of the same species, the areas layered on top of each other without conflicting with each other. And because the king areas were stacked and concentrated, their collective power became quite terrifying. As more and more king areas were added to the stack, the colors turned from blue and green to black. There was no way to know what tier all these space bugs were. Han Sen had to watch the colors of the collective king area instead. The darker a section of the king area was, the stronger it would be. There was no need to analyze the two space bugs with purple and red king areas, though. They were the half-deified foes, and their areas had reached the 9th tier and then been reset to 1st tier. Stick to the plan, Dragon 1 shouted. He rushed into the space bugs, activating his own area. Dragon 1's area was black, and it covered the entire sky. The space bugs were still some distance away, but they were covered by his area anyway. Han Sen could see a dragon, forged of black air, rising from Dragon 1's area. It was headed for the space bugs. What a powerful king area. With an AoE that strong, he could totally solo all the king-class space bugs. Why does he even need us? The dragon made from black air was still rising from the king area. It had king-class strength, and it was at no disadvantage against the space bugs. Plus, even if the black air dragon's body was torn to shreds, it would just immediately recompose itself. The thing was practically immortal. But Han Sen soon realized that he had underestimated the capabilities of the space bugs. Their blue areas continued to stack up, and when the black air dragon came into range, the bugs' king areas began to absorb the black air. The longer the dragon was there, the weaker it became. Against that massive, collective king area, the black air dragon's body would be no stronger than a balloon. It would be sucked dry, and the bugs' king area would only get stronger. An elemental consumption area? Han Sen asked with a frown. Yes, it is a consuming area. Any creature that enters will have their powers and life force sucked right out of them. Don't go into the areas that are stacked up, and you should especially avoid the ones that have turned black. Their consuming power can turn a king into a dried-up husk, Dragon 8 said to Han Sen. Han Sen nodded, then headed for one of the half-deified xenogenics. Dragon 8 and the others were working to lure the bug crowd elsewhere. They hadn't actually engaged the horde just yet. Compounded king areas like that were dangerous. If too many areas were stacked up, then their power could rival a half-deified. Fortunately, a horde like that lacked the mobility and agility of a solo creature. Dodging the stacked-up areas of the bugs wasn't all that difficult. Han Sen flew toward one of the half-deified bugs alone. He threw a coin at it from some distance away. The coin flew forward and entered the bug's purple and red king area. The coin shrank noticeably as it traveled through the king area. Clearly, the area was draining the coin's power. A very strong consuming power indeed, Han Sen thought in awe. To close-quarter combat fighters, a creature such as this would be a living nightmare. Even getting close to the beast would cause their life force and power to drain away. The fighter would become weaker, and the bug would become stronger. But the small coin finally attached itself to the bug's shell. Coin's suppressing and restrictive powers started to work. The bug's body shivered and started to sink, but it only shook a little. The half-deified space bug froze. Its eyes were like the eyes of a fly. As it looked at Han Senator, they looked angry, and the creature screamed at Han Senator then. It flapped its wings and flew toward Han Sen like lightning. So fast. That thing is definitely half-deified. Han Sen noticed that his own speed, in comparison, was so slow, and the suppression powers of the coins didn't seem to work on the bug. In fact, the coin was still getting smaller. Clearly, the bug's area was still consuming the coin's power. Not long after, the coin's power had run dry. Han Sen looked thoughtfully at the bug, But he didn't flee. He used an area, but not the Dongxin area. Instead, he made use of the beast soul he had received from the conch, Move Mountain area. The blue area spread around Han Sen's body, combining with the purple and red areas. It didn't show any reaction to the contact, and the two different colored areas overlapped. Han Sen prepared to strike the half-deified bug. Pang! Han Sen's fist and the half-deified bug's claw collided. The blade-like claws of the beast scratched Han Sen's armor, drawing a few light marks across its surface. The armor, however, wasn't broken. Han Sen's fist didn't have enough power to knock away the bug's claws. The bug squealed weirdly. Its body flashed with a purple and red light, leaving afterimages as it moved. A flurry of purple and red claw lights came toward Han Sen.
Yong, yong, yong.
All of those claws, which could tear through space with ease, came down on Han's senator. The strikes produced a number of light marks across his Dongxin armor, but the light scratches vanished quickly. Dragon One and the others kept an eye on Han's senator. If he couldn't kite the half-deified bug, they would have to abandon the fight and escape. But when they turned to watch, they found Han Sen fighting the half-deified creature head-to-head. Although he was suppressed, it was remarkable that the half-deified bug was unable to penetrate his armor. Is that guy really a first-tier king? Dragon 8 looked troubled. Even with his indestructible gold dragon body, he couldn't block the power of a half-deified strike. Han Sen, on the other hand, seemed to be handling the battle rather easily. Han Sen was unworried, but it wasn't because of the strength of his Dongxin armor. It was true that the Dongxin armor was very resilient. For a first-tier king, it would have ranked as a top-class defensive armor. But strength like that still wasn't enough to withstand the pummeling of a half-deified creature. Move Mountain Area's power was the real reason the bug couldn't hurt Han Sen. Move Mountain Area was actually quite special. It didn't increase Han Sen's power or weaken his enemies. Instead, it simply transferred power. First, Move Mountain Area required a carrier, and that carrier could not be a body. While the conch had used its own shell as a carrier, Han Sen had chosen to use his Dongxin armor. Under the effects of Move Mountain Area, any power that attacked the carrier would instead be absorbed by the carrier. It was like a hydroelectric plant on a river. The power of a river could crush many things, but the Move Mountain Area could separate some of that power and use it for other things. Unless the enemy's power was strong enough to break the Move Mountain Area and the designated carrier outright, then additional attacks wouldn't do any good. In fact, they would actually increase the carrier's defensive capabilities. But Move Mountain Area had two primary downsides. The first con was that the power absorbed by the carrier couldn't be transformed into offensive power and turned back on foes. The second con was something really bad. The more power the carrier absorbed, the more pressure it would endure. Although it wouldn't crush Han Sen's body, it would make him move very slowly. After using Move Mountain Area, Han Sen could shrug off powerful blows. But if he wanted to run or attack, he would be too slow to do so. Fortunately, in this situation, Han Sen had no plans to attack the half-deified bug. All he had to do was hold it in place until Dragon 1 killed his own bug and came over to help. So, for this purpose, Han Sen was happy to select Move Mountain Area. Move Mountain Area had its benefits. Although the bug's consuming area continued trying to drain power from Han Sen, it merely drained the stored power of the carrier. The enemy was recollecting its own power, and thus it didn't have any effect on Han Sen. The half-deified bug attacked Han Sen furiously. Han Sen tried to dodge at first, but he soon gave up the attempt. The bug's attacks were focused on the Dongxin armor, and the destructive powers the beast wielded had weakened. In the end, it didn't really affect Han Sen. But Han Sen was very encumbered by that power. He moved so slowly that it was impossible for him to strike back at the half-deified bug. Dragon 8 and the others were all frozen. They saw Han Sen floating in the air as if he wasn't the least bit worried. He ignored the half-deified bug's attacks like they were no more than a tickle. He was completely unmoving. The bug's creepy consuming area didn't seem to work on him, either. His power wasn't growing any weaker. They could tell that Han Sen's blue light area was doing something, but they were just as bewildered by it as Han Sen had been when he first saw it. It seemed like magic, an ability that defied rational explanation. Upon seeing this, Dragon 1 was greatly relieved. He had been worried that Han Sen wouldn't be able to keep a half-deified bug busy. Now, clearly, there was no need for concern. Dragon 1 focused all his power on attacking the other half-deified bug. As he drifted, Han Sen noticed that Dragon 8 was doing badly. Han Sen sent a few lazy attacks toward the ordinary core bugs surrounding Dragon 8, drawing their attention. In seconds, Han Sen was taking attacks from one half-deified bug and a few dozen of the King-class bugs. Even so, he was still in a totally fine condition. Dragon 8 and the others stared at him with wide eyes. Holy **T. What kind of defense is that? It's sick, a Dragon King couldn't help but exclaim. Han Sen was bored out of his mind. He had grown stronger, but his movement speed was so low. He moved like a snail. Running was out of the question. I'm going to give this beast soul to Wang Yuhang. He's the perfect person to become a punching bag. Move mountain area will suit him very well. He can take the brunt of the enemy's aggression while I attack. It really is perfect, Han Sen thought, quite pleased with the sudden idea. Because Han Sen had drawn the attention of so many of the bugs, Dragon 8 and the others were all free. Dragon 1 and a half-deified bug were still engaged in combat. Han Sen was bored, so he turned himself to watch the half-deified dragon fight. Han Sen had always admired the combat skills of the dragon. Dragon 1's enemy was half-deified as well, but the bug was getting destroyed. It would die soon. Also, while Dragon 1 was fighting the bugs in close-quarter combat, the consuming area didn't seem to affect him. Catcha! As Han Sen was deep in thought, he saw Dragon 1 punch through the side of the half-deified bug's head and straight into its brain. Despite losing its brain, however, it didn't stop fighting. With a few more strikes, Dragon 1 ripped the bug's body into pieces. It stopped moving. After Dragon 1 killed a half-deified bug, he flew over to Han Senator. He was going to kill the other half-deified bug that Han Sen had kept occupied. Dragon 1 engaged the bug. Relieving some of the pressure on Han Senator, he put away his move mountain area so that he could move freely again. The ordinary bugs were no threat to Han Senator. He used his Dongxian movement to travel through the swarm of bugs. The King-class bugs couldn't do a thing to him, and Han Sen soon found a chance to take out two. He didn't earn a beast soul, though. Han Sen made sure that he stayed within range of the half-deified bug as he traveled. After a while, Dragon 1 delivered a strike that heavily damaged the half-deified bug. Han Sen gathered up a coin on his finger. As he used saving money, the number on the coin started to increase. Just as the bug was about to die, Han Sen fired a coin with the number 12 on its surface. Pang! The badly injured bug exploded under the force of Han Sen's saving money. Mutant Xenogenic King hunted. Core Demon Bug. Xenogenic Gene found. Obtained King-class Mutant Beast Soul Core Demon Bug. Once the half-deified Core Demon Bugs were slain, the rest of the bugs descended into chaos. Dragon 1 and Han Sen got busy killing them. Some of them managed to escape, but most were killed. The group counted their spoils and found that they had 2 mutant core genes and 86 ordinary core genes. Dragon 1 kept his promise. He gave 1 mutant core gene and 43 normal core genes to Han Sen. Dragon 1 smiled at Han Sr. Would you be interested in continuing our cooperative efforts to hunt down core xenogenics? You can have half of everything.
Yeah, $.
This went well. Let's do more of this together, Dragon 8 quickly said. His eyes were shining. From what they could see, Han Sen was a giant meat shield. With Han Sen at the front, they could kill scary core xenogenics or destroy whole groups that they previously wouldn't have dared to provoke. Why not? Han Sen said with a nod. Han Sen knew what Dragon 1 had planned, but these dragons seemed very reliable. Cooperating with them wouldn't be a bad thing for Han Sen. Using Move Mountain Area wouldn't do him much good if he was by himself. Having awesome defense was pointless if someone wasn't there to kill the xenogenics. Cooperating was a bonus for both parties. There was no need to reject their offer. Dragon 1 and Han Sen signed another contract. They were very happy with the results, so they were keen to bring Han Sen with them as they traveled. Now that they were cooperating with Han Sen, they had no interest in killing ordinary xenogenics. They could deal with normal core xenogenics by themselves, so there was no need to hunt them now and split them with Han Senator instead. They went straight for the xenogenics they hadn't been able to take down before. Dragon 1 explained that to Han Sen, but Han Sen was fine with it. Many kings wished to kill core xenogeneics. Han Sen was lucky to have already found an opportunity to do so. Han Sen kept flying, playing with a core gene as he went. The core genes were smaller than a fist. They were transparent, like a shiny blue gem. Dragon 8 noticed Han Sen playing with the core gene, so he flew over to Han Sr. They're nothing special to look at, and there's no way to directly absorb them. You can use them to make a genofluid, though. If you bathe in it and practice your geno arts, you might end up improving your area. I was wondering if I could eat it, Han Sen said with a grin. Ah, you want to eat a core gene? This thing isn't meat. How would you eat it? Dragon 8 laughed. Han Sen put the core gene into his mouth and swallowed it. Dragon 8's smile froze in place. His mouth gaped, and he shouted, "Oh no! You really ate it." Han Sen licked his lips and said, "It didn't taste good. That was awful." "Right. You are human, yes? Are you humans a part of the consuming ant family?" Dragon 8 glanced at Han Sen with distaste, as if he was looking at a gross monster. "No, we definitely aren't." Han Sen laughed, but he didn't explain further. After waiting half a day, he managed to digest the core gene, and a familiar announcement played in his head. "King Class Gene." Dragon 1 and the others looked at Han Sen strangely. Han Sen kept randomly eating core genes, and they were growing concerned. Since Dollar could apparently eat core genes, they were worried that if he got hungry enough, they might end up as his food. Luckily, none of their fears came to pass. It made them feel very relieved. Mutant King Class Core Demon Bug Beast Soul, Gun Type. The type of the Beast Soul surprised Han Senator. It was a weapon Beast Soul, and it was a gun type one. It didn't seem to match with the creature he had fought. When Han Sen summoned the Beast Soul, however, he realized that this gun was different from the guns he had been envisioning. It was a laser handgun made of red and purple metal. It was 1 foot long, and it looked very futuristic. It was heavy, and there were many symbols drawn across its body. It was both uncanny and beautiful. When Han Sen put his power into the gun, it turned his power into a purple and red laser. Han Sen didn't have the chance to see what that laser did, though. Dragon 1 was guiding them to a core area on a planet called Dark Zone. The planet had many core xenogeneics, but the xenogeneics there were very frightening. It was easy to get yourself killed if you weren't careful, and even many half-deified elites had fallen on the surface of that planet. Ordinary kings usually didn't visit such dangerous places. But with Han Sen, their big meat shield, Dragon 1 opted to risk it. The group of them were approaching planet Dark Zone, but before they entered the atmosphere, a group of creatures came flying out from the planet to meet them. Han Sen at first thought they were xenogeneics, but when he looked closer, he saw that it was a group of the destroyed. Han Sen remembered 2 of them. One was Bar, and the other was Diarabber. They were already king-class elites. Upon seeing Bar, Han Sen felt his temples begin to throb. Bar was a madman with an invincible body. He was so strong that fighting him would be a massive nightmare. Luckily, Bar and Diarabber didn't recognize Han Sen in his Dongshin armor. They simply approached and stopped Han Sen's crew from going further. "Excuse me. Planet Dark Zone has been claimed by us, the destroyed. Please turn back now," Diarabber said, flying up to Dragon 1. "Since when is Planet Dark Zone the property of the destroyed?" Dragon 1 asked, his voice hard. He wasn't afraid of Diarabber. Diarabber smiled and said, "Everything will be back to normal soon. You guys can go in, but you will have to wait until we are done here." "What if we want to go in right now?" Dragon 1 stared at Diarabber. "Cut the crap." In his annoyance, Bar quickly drew the bone knife slung across his back. His eyes burned with a murderous look, and he was obviously ready to fight Dragon 1. Diarabber raised his hands to stop Bar, and then he calmly said, "Dragon 1, we destroyed have never offended the dragon. The core area has many places to destroy core xenogeneics. You guys don't have to cause us trouble over this planet Dark Zone, do you?" Dragon 1 frowned and started to respond, but all of a sudden, there was a booming sound. A giant mushroom cloud rose on the surface of planet Dark Zone, and a shockwave swept through the atmosphere. Diarabber's face changed. The destroyed seemed to completely forget the dragons as they turned and flew to planet Dark Zone at high speed. Dragon 1 and the others looked at each other with confusion. "Big brother, Should we go down and take a look? Dragon 8 asked, moving over to Dragon 1. His eyes lingered on the planet beneath them. As its name suggested, there seemed to be very little light on planet Dark Zone. Magnetic storms whirled over the planet, and the clouds rattled like mad as if there were many explosions underneath. Even so, it was impossible to see what actually lay on the surface. Dragon 1 didn't answer, but his eyes were also locked on planet Dark Zone. Just like Dragon 8, he had no idea what was down there. After the explosion, they couldn't see anything taking place on the planet anymore. Once the aftermath of the explosion settled out, planet Dark Zone returned to being quiet again. Bar and the others had re-entered the planet's atmosphere, and there was no more movement to be seen. Other than the roiling clouds, the planet had gone still. Big Brother, could this be a trap? Dia Robber and the others aren't trying to trick us, are they? Dragon 8 said. I don't think so. Dia Robber has no grudge with us. He wouldn't attempt to set up a blockade just to annoy us. Dragon 1 paused, and then he coldly said, even if it was a trap, there is no need for us to be afraid of them. Let's go and take a look, first and foremost. The others thought that made sense. Only kings and half-deifieds could come to the universal core area. Even if the destroyed were setting a trap, there was no need to be afraid. Han Sen was also curious about what was happening on the planet, so he had no problem with the plan. He followed them down onto planet Dark Zone in a careful approach. While Dragon 1 and the others were confident that they could defend themselves from the destroyed, they were also being careful. They opened their king areas before they reached the clouds. Once they traveled past the magnetic storms, they saw a giant, circular hole in the surface of the black planet. It looked like it had been made by a giant meteor strike. But Han Sen and the others had been outside of the planet only moments before, and they would have seen any meteor that came close enough to hit the planet. That explosion must have been caused by something already on the planet. They were too far away to make out much about the hole, though. Dragon 1 hesitated for a bit, but eventually decided to fly down towards the enormous crater. They flew closer to the surface of planet Dark Zone, and Han Sen and the others were soon able to see just how scary that hole was. When they approached it, the hole seemed to have no bottom. Aside from the giant pit, they couldn't see anything else on the surface of planet Dark Zone. There were no core xenogenics about either. Bar and the others had disappeared. What is this? Dragon 8 asked, pointing toward the center of the big hole. No one answered him, though. Han Sen and Dragon 1 had already seen it, but they didn't know what it was either. In the center of the hole, there was something like a goose egg. It was glowing a dark green color, but it was as big as a basketball court. Han Sen and the others soon got close enough to see Dia Robber and his people standing next to the stone goose egg. They were all frozen, staring unblinkingly at the egg. Han Sen had no idea what they were doing. You guys need a hand? Dragon 1 asked as he drifted toward them. He didn't want to cause a misunderstanding. Han Sen followed Dragon 1 over to the stone goose egg. He looked at the thing carefully, but he didn't see anything special about it. It was just a normal goose egg, albeit larger and made of stone. Dia Robber didn't reply to Dragon 1. The destroyed still stared at the goose egg stone, and they didn't try to stop Dragon 1 from coming closer. Han Sen and Dragon 1 glanced at each other. They were both suspicious. Dia Robber and Bar were not top-tier king-class fighters, and that was because they were very slow. But with their talents, they would eventually rank highly among the kings, or even become deified. Something very dangerous must have happened to render all of those destroyed motionless. Assuming they weren't pretending, of course. Han Sen couldn't imagine what might have happened, but whatever it was, it had even managed to trap Bar. With his grumpy personality and murderous mind, he was the sort of person who would try to fight fate itself. Yet Bar, a man who wasn't afraid of anything, had been compelled to remain in one spot like that. He seemed almost comatose. It was difficult to imagine what he might have seen, but Han Sen and Dragon 1, as they looked at the stone goose egg, saw nothing. Dia Robber, what is going on? Dragon 1 asked as he walked closer. Dia Robber gritted his teeth, but he remained silent. Another destroyed king, now looking as if he had woken up from a dream, started to scream, "It's over! It's all over!" What is over? Dragon 8 asked. The king didn't answer. He just kept on screaming at the top of his lungs, his eyes wide and afraid. Then, he ran to the goose egg stone like a madman. "Stop!" Dia Robber shouted, but the man didn't stop. Dia Robber flew forward and grabbed the destroyed king who was running toward the goose stone egg. He slammed the man into the ground. "I said stop. Didn't you hear me?" Dia Robber's face looked grim. That destroyed king screamed, "Goth and the others are still down there. We have to save them. We have to save them." Dia Robber's expression darkened, and he quietly said, "Observe the situation first. Without my order, no one is permitted to get close." "Dia Robber, what is going on?" Dragon One knew that something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what. Dia Robber turned around and looked at Dragon One. "Considering what's happened, I'm not going to lie. 60 destroyed kings came to Planet Dark Zone to hunt xenogeneics. We planned on cleaning this place up, but while we were talking with you, for some reason, this thing crushed our camp. All the destroyed kings are gone." Han Sen and Dragon One felt a chill at his words. 6 destroyed kings remained, including Dia Robber and Bar, which meant that more than 50 king-class destroyed had just disappeared. That was a very frightening thought. Even if a giant meteor struck the planet, it couldn't wipe out 50 kings that easily. Plus, there are no meteors around to suggest that is what happened. Where did this thing come from? Han Sen stared at the giant goose egg stone. He was frozen like Dia Robber. Maybe they went somewhere else? Dragon One looked around. Planet Dark Zone was big. A few dozen kings could certainly hide on its surface. They could just dip into a cave, and nobody would be able to find them.
No.
They were waiting for us at camp. If they escaped this, they would definitely have revealed themselves by now. Dia Robber shook his head. Dragon One wanted to say something, but before he could, there was a loud cracking noise. A crevice had suddenly appeared on the giant goose egg. Han Sen and the others fell back. They immediately expanded their king areas as they stared at the goose egg stone. Catcha! Catcha! More cracks opened across the surface of the goose egg stone. The cracks were very well aligned, so they obviously weren't like ordinary cracks one might find in a well-weathered stone. Instead, the perfectly spaced cracks opened straight up and down. Boom! Countless dark green claws emerged from the top and bottom of the stone. Holy sh*T. That is a big bug. Dragon 8 screamed with wide eyes. The stone might have looked rather like an egg, but the thing inside it was definitely not a baby goose. It was actually a xenogeneic bug, one that looked like a centipede. Its body was curled around itself, so all its claws were hidden. It had simply made itself look like a goose egg. Now, the disturbing creature was stretching out its body, making itself look very scary in the process. It revealed its teeth as it stared down on the destroyed and dragon around it. Blood and gore were smeared across the bug's belly. It was probably the remains of the missing destroyed kings. Everyone still alive knew that somehow, this xenogeneic had eaten more than 50 of the destroyed kings in a single second. The realization was chilling. No one issued a command. Everyone, including Han Sen and Dragon One, immediately turned and flew away. They were going to leave Planet Dark Zone. But just as they were about to fly up into the clouds, the whole sky of the planet turned dark green. It was like a giant green crystal had formed to cloak the entire planet. Even the small amounts of light that made it through the clouds were dyed that same greenish shade. Pang! Both the destroyed group and the dragon group fell from the sky like meteors. They hit the planet so hard that their bodies punched deep holes into the surface. Air restriction area. With this kind of radius, it must be a deified xenogeneic. Dragon 8 pronounced as he climbed out of his hole. His face looked grave. That isn't an air restriction area. Han Sen looked glum, too. He looked at the ground around them. The area looked as if it had managed to cover the entire planet. None of them could fly away now. Even more frightening was the fact that this wasn't just an air restriction. It had another power, too. Before Han Sen could analyze it further, though, the giant insect leaped forward. Its mountainous body moved with uncanny speed, and dark green substance chains seethed in the air around it. The chains wrapped around its entire body, their outer edges as sharp as razors. Han Sen used his Dongxian aura as he turned to run. He didn't dare use his move mountain area. It would be totally useless against a monster like this. A xenogeniac like this had enough raw power to crush his move mountain area without breaking a sweat. His Dongxian armor wouldn't be able to withstand strength of that magnitude. He would die in moments. Boom! The weird bug attacked. Two of the kings were too close to the creature to run, so they had no choice but to attack. They tried to use their own powers to fight back against the insect, but the weird bug was able to swallow them whole. The weird bug then dove into the ground, vanishing under the surface and leaving a large hole behind. The ground shook beneath Han Sen like a violent earthquake. He wanted to run, but after a few frantic steps, he came to a black hole in the ground. A king running next to Han Sen was swallowed by the insect as it launched itself up from that hole in the ground. The weird bug hung in the air for a moment, then turned and dove back under the earth. F***CKU. Dragon 8 screamed when he saw the insect eat one of the dragons. It made him so angry that he used his giant gold dragon. He sent a punch toward the pit in the ground. Boom! The hole collapsed on itself, and the weird bug didn't come out again. It didn't scream, either. Careful! Dragon 1 sprinted toward Dragon 8 and knocked the man backward, then dodged away himself. There was another boom as dirt and dust fountained up where Dragon 8 had been standing only a moment before. There was now another large hole, and the strange bug had re-emerged. Half of its body was above ground, and it looked like some strange tower as it swung its claws. No one moved to attack the creature. Running was the only thought on their minds. They all knew that fighting the beast would be a useless move. There was nothing they could do against such a scary deified xenogeniac. Han Sen was running, and he was running very fast. He was very good at fleeing impossible fights, and he was confident that he could break the weird bug's king area and leave planet Dark Zone. Of course, he needed the bug to stop chasing him first. Even if he could break the air restriction area, he wouldn't make it very far if the bug was still pursuing him. So, Han Sen put conscious effort into keeping a low profile. As soon as he had the chance to, he would use his super god spirit to leave planet Dark Zone. And in regards to the others, Han Sen could only pity them. At a time like this, it was every man for himself. Han Sen was not their daddy. There was no need to make a sacrifice on their behalf. Han Sen's face suddenly grew pale. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and his heart leaped into his throat. Without hesitation, Han Sen used all his strength to leap forward. The bug erupted up through the ground he had just been standing on. Han Sen's body had almost touched its mouth, and the dark green substance chains around the creature were like blades. One of them brushed Han Sen's leg, which was clad in the Dongxian armor. The chain sliced cleanly through his Dongxian armor, leaving a deep gash in Han Sen's leg. Han Sen ignored the pain burning in his leg and continued to run. If he stopped now, he would die. The weird bug was back underground, though. It seemed to swim under the ground like some sort of strange fish. Every time it came out again, it left a 10-meter hole in its wake. Perhaps it was because Han Sen's leg was leaving a trail of blood behind, but Han Sen noticed that the weird bug seemed to be focusing all its attention on chasing him specifically. I cannot be this unlucky, Han Sen thought, feeling sick. He hoped he was wrong, but when that bug burst out of the ground right next to him again, he knew that his hunch had been correct. The insect was after him, and him alone. F***CKU. Han Sen was slower than the weird bug, so he wouldn't be able to dodge the bug again. He flew into the sky, his body releasing a white light. He was in super god spirit mode now, and he avoided the weird bug's gnashing teeth as he flew higher and higher. The bug didn't seem to have any ranged attacks aside from its king area, so Han Sen focused on flying as far away as he could. But just as he thought he was about to leave the area, he heard a buzzing sound. Transparent wings had sprouted from the weird bug's back. It flew toward Han Sen at incredible speed, and within a single second, it was right below Han Sen. All of its dark green substance chains were knotted together, spinning over each other like some enormous blender. The weird bug's open mouth was coming right for Han Senator. It was like a big whale, ready to munch on a little fish. Dollar will die. Dragon 1 could see that Han Sen was about to be swallowed by the weird insect. Instead of being sad for Han Sen, he was sad about what Han Sen's death would mean for all of them. Even Han Sen, who could somehow nullify the air restriction, couldn't escape this monster. If Han Sen couldn't escape, then it likely meant death for them all. Dragon 8, who was following Dragon 1, also saw what was about to happen. He looked just as glum. Boom. In the sky, the insect's enormous mouth was closing around Han Senator. Its sharp teeth were about to clamp down on Han Sen's body. Dragon 1 and the others couldn't bring themselves to look at the horrible sight. They turned their heads and continued running as hard as they could. They hoped they could find a place on Planet Dark Zone that wasn't smothered by the air restriction area. That was the only way they might be able to escape this hellhole. Han Sen's body didn't break because of the weird insect's attack, though. He was still in Super God Spirit mode, so the creature's incredible power was unable to touch him. While the weird insect's teeth pierced through his body, they didn't actually bring him any harm. Han Sen's body was incorporeal now, rather like a ghost's. He moved effortlessly through the weird insect's teeth and flesh, and he was on the verge of escaping the creature's body when he realized that he didn't want to leave just yet. He turned around, heading deeper into the maw of the weird insect. The hard bug shell and flesh couldn't restrict Han Sen's movement. He moved quickly through the insect's entire body. But Han Sen found that the inside of the creature was like jade. Even its organs and vessels had taken the texture of xenogeneic genes. There was no weakness to be found anywhere, so it would be hard for Han Sen to hurt the creature from the inside. But Han Sen had found the beast's xenogeneic core located in its brain. It was a green core that shone like the stars. Time passed. Han Sen's Super God Spirit mode could last much longer now that he had reached King class. He couldn't use it forever, but he could certainly last around half an hour. Staying close to the green deified core of the beast, Han Sen gathered up power in his hand to perform Super Spank. Once he built up sufficient power, he moved toward the green core. BZZD. The substance chains went crazy under the impact of Han Sen's hand. They were like rubber bands that couldn't be broken. Roar. The weird insect felt a sharp pain in its head, and so it roared. Its body hit the ground, then drilled deep inside. It decided to go for Dragon 1. The insect snapped up a destroyed king, plunging through the man's king area like it wasn't even there. Blood splattered everywhere. It was like it had eaten a sheep, not a scary king. Dragon 1 headed for the other side of the planet. He tried using every power at his disposal to fight back, but against that deified insect, all of his powers seemed to be useless. The scariest thing about the creature was its king area. If they met an ordinary deified xenogeneic, Dragon 1 and the others could still make an easy escape. But this weird insect's area power not only restricted air travel, it stopped any powers being used in the atmosphere. Even using skills or items to teleport was impossible. They were trapped. Run. Run for your life. Dragon 1 and the others used all their various powers to try to escape, but the creature picked them off one by one. In the end, only Dragon 1, Dragon 8, Bar, and Dia Robber were left alive. They were injured, but they were still running. Somehow, they all started to work together. They knew that if they didn't, they had no chance of surviving. The bodies of Dragon 8 and Bar were special. They were almost immortal. That incredible power allowed them to escape some attacks and continue breathing. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber were top-tier kings. They were invincible when it came to fighting others of the king class, but attempting to deal with this scary deified was enough to leave them injured and bleeding. Boom. The weird insect clamped its jaw around Bar's leg, and Dia Robber took that moment to gather up 3 different types of power. He created a triangle composed of 3 different energies. Light blossomed inside that triangle, breaking space and shaking the air around it. The light shot forward, smacking right into the weird insect's mouth. But the weird insect just swallowed the light, which disappeared harmlessly down its throat. Dia Robber looked pale and hopeless. That was the strongest move he could conjure, but it hadn't affected the weird insect in the least. That insect wasn't an ordinary deified monster. Its area power and the strength of its body both indicated that whatever it was, this creature was far better than an average deified xenogeneic. Although they hadn't exhausted all of their strength yet, Dragon 1 and the others knew that if they could not escape the weird insect's area, then they were sure to die. This is bad. Why did we randomly encounter a xenogeneic with such a scary area? Dragon 8 groused loudly as he ran. Dragon 1 remained silent, though. He knew that complaining would help no one. He needed to last as long as he could, grasping every additional second that he could, in the hope that a miracle might save them. Maybe a new idea would occur to one of them, something that could help. Robber was of a similar mindset. In that place, no one could save them. Even if the deified elites of his race knew they were in danger, deifieds were not permitted access to the universal core area. Only king-class beings were allowed to enter this place. You could not be one level higher nor one level lower. If I am to die, I do not want to die fleeing, Bar snarled with a furious look on his face. He turned around and sprinted towards the weird insect. His body blazed with a sword light. Robber started to stop him. But then he realized that with the situation they were currently in, no matter how hard they ran, they could not run far enough. Stopping Bar was pointless. Bar slashed the weird insect's head, but the bone knife never made contact with the weird insect's shell. The substance chains on its body caught the knife and crushed it. Bar's hand touched the substance chains. His arm vanished in a cloud of fleshy scraps. The weird insect opened its mouth to chase down the injured Bar. Bar couldn't run any further, though, and he didn't want to. He summoned his area power and used his left hand to punch the weird insect's face. Bar's powerful area was as weak as an eggshell before the brute force of the weird insect's teeth. Bar's king area shattered, and his body was bitten in half. The bitten section of his body disappeared down the creature's gullet. Although Bar could respawn and gain strength each time, the process required his cells to be close by. Now that half of his body was swallowed and digested, he could no longer respawn. The weird insect swung around, going for what was left of Bar's body. Bar was still conscious, but the situation was hopeless. Roar! As the weird bug came down to eat the other half of his body, Bar realized he was going to die. But then the bug suddenly squealed. Its body became straight and rigid, like it had been electrified. Bar and the others froze in place. They weren't sure what was happening. Blurg. The weird insect opened its mouth, then spewed out dark green blood like a fountain. The blood sprayed all over Bar. Blood continued to fountain out of the insect's mouth, spilling all over the place. It looked as if something was fighting its way out. Dragon 1 and Dragon 8 asked together, squinting at the figure that emerged. They could barely believe their eyes. They wanted to scream, but their question came out as a whisper. He had been eaten by a deified creature, and yet he hadn't been killed. It was a miracle. Han Sen finished pulling himself free and climbed to his feet. He didn't have any blood on him. He didn't even look injured. Dragon 1 stared at him in disbelief. The weird insect shrieked and thrashed a little. It looked to be in a great deal of pain. Instead of pursuing Han Sen, it just drilled back into the earth and disappeared. The green area power that had covered the sky suddenly disappeared. Dragon 8 stared at the hole it left behind in bewilderment. What did you do? Dragon 8 asked slowly, his voice a little shaken. Nothing. I just thought I'd hurt it a little. Han Sen paused for a moment, then said, let's go. Once it heals, I doubt we'll be able to escape again. Putting action to words, Han Sen left the ground and headed out of Planet Dark Zone's atmosphere. He had wanted to kill the weird insect, but the creature was way too strong. It had taken all of Han Sen's strength to keep using Super Spank on the weird insect's core. Despite exhausting all of his energy and approaching the time limit of his super god spirit body, he was only able to leave a single crack across the core. He hadn't been able to actually break it. Luckily, although the weird insect was strong, it wasn't smart. The crack in the creature's core was small and not terribly threatening, but the bug had chosen to run away even so. If it had continued going after Han Sen, his super god spirit would have given out eventually. He could have died. Dragon 1, Dragon 8, Robber, and the newly reassembled Bar didn't hesitate. They followed Han Sen away from Planet Dark Zone. The 5 of them didn't speak, and they flew as fast as they could until they were well beyond Planet Dark Zone. The weird insect didn't follow, which all of them were incredibly grateful for. It looks like we're all injured, and I need to go take a rest. Let's split up here, Han Sen said, preparing to use his self-universe cogwheel to leave the universal core area. He had an idea about how to deal with the weird insect, but he was too weak to do anything about it now. He would have to wait until he was stronger. Dragon 1 said, If you still want to work together, we should set up a time and place to meet. It will be hard to fit you into my schedule, but we can discuss this when I find the time. Han Sen didn't want to set up a meeting time because he was currently in the Extreme King. He wouldn't always be able to come here on a schedule. Should we have a way of contacting each other? Dragon 8 said. In the Geno universe, the stronger ones always earned respect. Everyone wanted friends who were stronger than them. Especially friends like Han Senator. He was a first-tier king capable of fighting against a deified xenogenic. Plus, he had proven his ability to hurt many scary people. It almost seemed like he was deified already. If someone could make friends with him, they would. After all, it would be better to have him as an ally than an enemy. Dragon 1 and Dragon 8 wanted to maintain a good relationship with him. Even if they couldn't be friends, they wanted Han Sen to think positively about them. Finding yourself at odds with someone like him was never a good plan. So you are Dollar. You are even stronger than the stories say. When would you like to fight me? Bar asked, looking at Han Sen. Dia Robber laughed and said, Bar, stop messing around. Today, Dollar was the sole reason that we survived. If you don't mind, Dollar, please leave us a contact number. We would like to pay the debt we now owe you. It's okay. I was just trying to save myself. You don't need to contact me again. We'll meet again whenever luck decides, Han Sen said, then used his self-universe cogwheel. After a while, a giant metal cogwheel door appeared, and Han Sen walked through it and left. Now that his self-universe cogwheel had been activated, it would continue running on its own. Using it didn't require any additional energy. Opening the door to the Universal Core Hall did have some requirements, though. Once Han Sen began the process of summoning the door using his self-universe cogwheel, he couldn't move it. If he moved away from the door, he would destroy the connection. At that point, he'd have to start the process all over. In addition, summoning the door took a while. It would be impossible to summon during combat, so the door couldn't be used as an escape route if Han Sen got into trouble. Plus, when he returned to the core area, he would end up exactly where he had left the previous time. He wouldn't just randomly teleport to some other location in the core area. Brother Dragon 1, who is this Dollar? Can you tell me? Dia Robber looked at Dragon 1. Dragon 1 shook his head. We met him by chance, and we worked together twice. We don't know much about him. No more than you guys do. I have never heard of a race called human before. How could they have produced an elite like that? It is confusing. Dia Robber asked, his expression mystified. I am afraid that because of Dollar, humans might become famous across the universe. We don't know if there are any other strong humans. If he's the only one with such strength, like Kong Fei was, he would still be alone. He cannot change the world in that case, Dragon 1 answered. The four of them lost themselves in deep thought. None of them said anything, and eventually, they all used their self-universe cogwheels to leave the Universal Core Hall. After Dia Robber returned to the Destroyed, he went looking for other destroyed kings. He asked the ones he could find to stay in the vicinity of Planet Dark Zone. They were to wait inside the core area, and if Dollar reappeared, they would contact Dia Robber at once. Coincidentally, when Dragon 1 returned to the dragon, he did exactly the same thing. Clearly, they were waiting for Han Sen to return to the core area, too. Han Sen came out of the Universal Core Hall back in Underwater Town. Bauer was lying on his bed, and she rubbed her eyes when she heard movement. Seeing that it was Han Sen, she leaped into his arms. Dad? Where were you? Why didn't you take me? Bauer lifted her lips. I reached King Class a few days ago. I got pulled into the core area. Han Sen looked at Bauer and asked, Can you and the little bird enter the core area? Core area? What is that? Bauer asked in confusion. If Bauer did not know, then she probably couldn't join him. And the little red bird was deified, so it couldn't go in with him either. Otherwise, Han Sen could use the little red bird to kill the weird insect. Han Sen had used his super god spirit mode for too long, and his body was exhausted. He felt very powerless and sore. Han Sen didn't plan on returning to the core area anytime soon. He rested for a few days and ate some of the core xenogenic genes each day. His number of king genes kept increasing. His body had almost recovered when the day came for him to enter Destiny's Tower. He didn't want to be late, and so he arrived at the site an hour early. The Extreme King were quite effective. They had 4 elites on standby to open the door of Destiny's Tower for Han Sen and let him in. Han Sen had long been curious about Destiny's Tower, and that was because this stone Destiny's Tower was just like the metal Destiny's Tower inside his Sea of Soul. Aside from the towers being made of different materials, one having been made of stone and other having been made of metal, there was no difference. For deified elites used their powers to force open the gate to Destiny's Tower. Only one person could go in while the gate was being held up. Once he received the signal, Han Sen immediately ran into the tower. Dang! Han Sen had just entered the tower when the door slammed shut behind him. Because Han Sen knew the process, though, he wasn't afraid. The 4 deified elites had to use formation powers just to get the door open, and it could only be kept open for a single second. It simply wasn't feasible to keep it open any longer than that. Han Sen was given 1 month to spend in Destiny's Tower. When that month was up, the door would open again, and Han Sen would be allowed to leave. Han Sen looked around the tower. He had heard there was supposed to be an amazing Geno art located inside the tower, and any creature that learned it would be able to increase the speed of their evolution. But everyone who left the tower seemed to practice different Geno arts. That made Han Sen curious about whether the rumor was true. Han Sen was on the 1st floor of Destiny's Tower. The layout was exactly like his own Destiny's Tower, but there were some paintings hanging on the walls of this tower. The pictures were supposedly the Geno arts of legend, but when Han Sen looked closer, he realized that the pictures were not Geno arts at all. They were drawings of people. The pictures were of a man. Han Sen couldn't tell if he was human, crystallizer, extreme king, or one of the sky. They all looked so similar that it was hard to tell the precise race of the man in the painting. But this man wasn't drawn like an average person. He was drawn like a god atop an altar. Every wall held a picture depicting the same man in a different position, but no matter how he was posed, he seemed to be looking out of the picture with disdain. It was somehow uncomfortable to meet the painted man's gaze. Although Han Sen knew it was just a drawing, not a living man, the painted man gave him a chilled feeling. It was like the eyes of the man could see right through his soul or something. Han Sen frowned. The longer he looked at the painting, the more he wanted to avoid it. That wasn't normal. Is there something wrong with this drawing? Or is it like a jade spirit in the white jade jing? Is it actually alive? Han Sen looked at the man in the painting, but try as he might, he couldn't discern its true nature. He looked across the whole 1st floor, but he found nothing except for pictures of that one man. Han Sen silently moved on to the 2nd floor. Upon reaching the 2nd floor, Han Sen frowned. This floor had paintings of the man on every wall as well. He was just posed in different positions than he had been on the 1st floor. This entire tower isn't just full of this one man's paintings, is it? Han Sen's heart jumped, and so he proceeded to the 3rd floor. Of course, Han Sen was unlucky. His guess had been correct. The 3rd floor held the same paintings. Each floor in the tower had 8 walls. Each wall had a painting of its own. Han Sen walked all the way from the 1st floor to the 6th floor, and he saw 48 of the man's paintings in total. It was the same person in every painting. He was just in a different position in each one. He would be sitting in one, while in another, he could be standing or lying down. All the pictures had the man in a different position, but no matter what his position was, the man's eyes were always the same. Han Sen hated those eyes. The man wasn't ugly. In fact, Han Sen thought he was quite handsome. The man had a smile that should have been lovable, but instead, Han Sen loathed it. He couldn't put his finger on why. Han Sen was a little surprised by that realization because he didn't like judging people by their appearance. It didn't matter if a person looked nice or horrible. He would not form a real opinion on them until he learned more about who they really were. But now, looking at these paintings, Han Sen already hated this man. That was not normal at all. Trying to suppress his hatred, Han Sen climbed to the highest floor. This was the 7th floor. If the Stone Destiny's Tower was related to his Metal Destiny's Tower, the 7th floor should have a space by Sima. That was where Han Sen imprisoned people in his own tower. As soon as Han Sen stepped onto the 7th floor of Destiny's Tower, he stopped dead in his tracks. There were no more of those paintings on the 7th floor. There was just a stone platform in the middle of the room. Someone was sitting atop the stone platform, and Han Sen realized instantly that it was the same man showcased in the 48 paintings across the lower floors. He sat atop the stone platform, his legs crossed like a Buddha. His hands were down, and his eyes were shut. It was like he was sleeping. Han Sen couldn't detect a life force coming from the man, though. The man was like a statue. With Han Sen's eyesight, though, he could tell the man actually was alive. He could see the man's pores and the pink of his skin. Han Sen could see most of his vessels, too. Aside from the fact that he wasn't breathing, he really did look like someone who was alive. Han Sen used the Dongxian aura to inspect the man. It was odd that the man looked so alive while giving off utterly no indication of life force. Even after scanning the man, Han Sen couldn't tell if he was living or dead. That was extremely weird. While Han Sen was examining the man, some sort of odd wave began to pass through the air around the man's body. The air moved in a circle, like a nearly invisible whirlpool. Han Sen took a step back. He soon realized that the swirl was just a life force, not anything harmful. What astonished Han Sen the most, though, was that the black crystal armor in his Sea of Soul reacted to the whirlpool. The armor began to tremble. A mysterious power flowed out of the armor and sank into Han Sen's body. Han Sen felt himself become really heavy. It was like the cells inside his body had been frozen in place by that mysterious power. The Dongxian Sutra and Han Sen's other primary geno-arts had been locked down by the strange power as well. Only the original Water King body and a few other powers Han Sen had absorbed were still active inside his body. "What is this?" Han Sen asked in sudden trepidation. Then the man slowly opened his eyes. It looked like he was smiling at Han Sen, but he wasn't. Han Sen's heart flared with that feeling of hatred again, but this time, it was 1,000 times stronger than it had been when he saw those pictures. Han Sen managed to suppress the feelings and keep them from showing on his face. Han Sen finally figured out where the feelings were coming from, though. The passionate hatred inside him was flowing out of the black crystal armor. It wasn't his own emotion. The man stared at Han Sen the same way he'd gazed out of the paintings. He smiled and coldly asked, "Do you believe that this world has a god?" Han Sen's heart jumped. He didn't mind hearing about deifieds, but he really did mind hearing the word God. This sensitivity came from his time in the sanctuaries. Since he first entered the sanctuaries, he had come to despise the word God. Even hearing it would put him in a bad mood for a long time, especially when it came to the events with the 7th team. They had really affected Han Sen. This guy cannot be the god that claims to grant wishes, can he? Han Sen stared at the man who sat atop the stone platform, and he really thought that this man had to be the one he had heard so much about. Plus, the black crystal armor's reaction made Han Sen much more alarmed. "I've never heard of any of the Extreme King dying in this Destiny's Tower. People claim to learn a lot from their time in the tower. No matter what is said about this place, there is never a hint of something fatal residing inside. Otherwise, with so many people having already entered this place, at least one of them should have died," Han Sen thought to himself. No wonder each of the Extreme King learns something different inside the tower, though. There is no geno-art here. There is just this living god. Han Sen froze, and he didn't answer. The man asked again, "Young man, do you believe that God exists in this world?" "Yes," Han Sen answered with certainty. But inside he thought, "Of course I believe. Han's big brother is Dollar God." The man nodded, and he went on to say, "If I told you I was God, would you believe me?" "I would," Han Sen said, feigning cooperation. He wanted that man to keep talking. After all the time Han Sen had spent tracking down bits and pieces of this man's exploits, he badly wanted to know what the man's true goal was, or where he might have come from. The man didn't seem impressed or concerned by Han Sen's answer, though. His expression hadn't changed, and he still smiled. "It is a fated meeting that you have come here to speak with me. I can fulfill one wish for you. You can say whatever you want, as it should be something deep in your heart. You only have one chance. No matter what you say, it will be fulfilled. But you cannot change what you wish for." "This guy is just like King Kun," Han Sen chuckled darkly in his heart. He looked at the man. "I can make any wish?" Han Sen asked, looking at the man. "Any wish that you desire. God can do anything," the man said calmly. Han Sen frowned. and he didn't speak. Making a wish seemed like a simple process, but there were many traps. Each member of the seventh team from the Alliance had made a wish, but before the end, each one of them had regretted their wish. Something disastrous that they never expected had befallen them. For instance, Han Sen could wish for a lot of money. God would set up an accident and drop a lot of money right into his lap. Things would seem great, until it eventually came out that the money had belonged to a psychotic killer. While Han Sen would indeed be the recipient of great fortune for a time, he would eventually be killed by that psychotic killer. God was supposed to be an abstract concept. Once people made their wishes to God, they were supposed to move on with their lives, not linger in the moment. If people really thought that God was a person who granted wishes like this man, it would be very dangerous. If someone believed in God, then they believed that God was a real force in the world. Every action he took would have ramifications in the world. He wouldn't just be able to make something out of nothing. So, whatever wish a person made should be something that already existed inside the universe someplace. These items would, of course, have a pre-established connection to the universe. Any rare item that someone wished for would be deeply associated with the workings of the world. Han Sen used to think that, if God really existed and he could really fulfill wishes, then he might be a special sort of life form that had causal powers. A person had to wish for something they wanted, but the consequences of the item might befall the wisher. So, the rarer the item was, the greater the consequences could be. The price that had to be paid could be huge. If a person wished for $10,000, and that $10,000 were with a mother who wanted to heal her ailing son, and that $10,000 were then given to the wisher, the son would die from lack of treatment. That death and that mother's hatred would end up on the wisher. If the wisher was greedy and wished for $1 million, the wish might hurt 100 lives. The wisher would be hated by 100 families. Having 100 different families seeking revenge against you would be a high price to pay. Those were just Han Sen's predictions and guesses, though. They might not have actually been true, but according to what happened to the seventh team, the guesses were in the realm of possibilities. It didn't matter if someone wished for immortality or a return to their youth. Every wish had its price. That price also took away the governance of a person's own life and death. Perhaps it was because there were too many consequences, but sometimes, not even death brought freedom from the consequences of a wish. They would have to continue their miserable existence to pay back the debt. If this theory is correct, then everyone who entered this Destiny's Tower should have paid a price. But I haven't heard of any misfortunes among the people who have come here. Why? Han Sen frowned. The guy that was claiming to be God noticed Han Sen's continued silence. He smiled and said, "You can think about what you wish to want to make. There are 48 God pictures. They all have my will in them. You can go and take a look. Perhaps they will help you decide. That will be the first gift I give you. When you have thought of the wish you seek to make, come to me and I will make it come true." Han Sen didn't leave. He looked at the man and asked, "If I make a wish, do I have to pay something back in maid?" The man continued smiling and said, "You will." Han Sen was surprised that the man answered. He had thought the self-proclaimed God wouldn't admit this, even if asked. Han Sen immediately followed up his question. "What do I need to give you?" The man looked at Han Sen and didn't answer the question. "You are not the first person to ask me this question, and you surely won't be the last. I can answer you, but if I answer, you must make a wish. Do you agree?" Han Sen thought for a brief moment, and then said seriously, "I agree." The man smiled and said, "The wish you make will be fulfilled, and that is because it is what you deserve. It is what I deserve. If I want 100 wives, that means the wives will already have been my wives? What sense does that make?" Han Sen was frozen. What the man said was something Han Sen couldn't accept, but when he thought about it some more, his breath caught. He now knew why the man would say this. What the man had said was reversed. If you tried to understand it in reverse, then the sentence made sense. But the causal relationship reversed it. Just as Han Sen predicted, if God was a creature that had causal powers, then he could reverse causal relationships. For example, take a person who wished for $1 million. Normally, the person would have to work for 10 years to earn that much money. But God's powers reversed the causal relationship. God could give that $1 million to the person immediately, and then the person would have to work to pay it back. If someone wished for far more than they could ever pay back, then the wisher would destroy the causal relationship, which would create a serious imbalance within that causal power. It was difficult to imagine what might happen. If this line of thought is true, making a wish is like prepaying wages. If my wish is something I can pay back, then I might not get hurt. Or at least, I might not get hurt very much. Just like Han Jinji. He made a wish, but the wish he made didn't backfire on him, Han Sen thought. The man smiled. You are smart. You understand the meaning behind wishes. I believe you will be able to make the correct wish. Han Sen thought to himself. Many of the extreme king have entered Destiny's Tower, and their lives don't seem to be falling apart afterwards. They must have deciphered the meaning behind the man's words. But is it really true that no one was greedy enough to make a wish they were unable to make good on? Han Sen didn't know if this guy was the same self-proclaimed god that the 7th team had encountered. Whether he was or not, though, Han Sen believed there to be something amiss with this offer. He just hadn't figured out what was wrong yet. When Han Sen didn't speak, the man went on to say, Young man, make a wish you are able to handle. It will be good for you, and it will not harm you. The way he said this made Han Sen frown. There was something familiar about this whole interaction, actually. Hang on. I forgot to consider God's perspective in this wishing process. God wouldn't just randomly help people. Why is this guy willing to help others by fulfilling their wishes? Maybe the wishing process isn't like a prepaid wage, but more like an interest-charging loan? This guy might be some sort of celestial loan shark. The thought gave Han Sen a sudden chill. Without a doubt, this god must be benefiting somehow from the wishes that were made. No way he would just sit here and grant wishes out of kindness. There had to be something this god needed that the wishes were providing. Most likely, that benefit would come from the interest rate he charged for each wish. The bigger the wish that was made, the more interest the wisher would owe. And that meant God would benefit even more. As he considered the idea, Han Sen became increasingly convinced that he was right. Han Sen might not have figured out the process perfectly, but he was confident he had gotten the core of the relationship correct. God wasn't some benevolent fulfiller of dreams. He was more like a vampire. But God wouldn't be interested in money, obviously. Han Sen hadn't quite figured out what form this god would want his interest in when he collected it. Han Sen's face turned sour as he thought about all this. If his guesses were even remotely accurate, then regardless of what he wished for, he was still going to lose something. After all, loan sharks kept the interest going even after payment. I still don't know what wish to make. Let me go and have a look at those godly pictures before I make one, Han Sen said, as he looked at the man. You really should think about it, yes? You only get one chance. The man smiled encouragingly. Han Sen left the 7th floor of Destiny's Tower. As he walked, he kept on thinking, from what I have been able to see thus far, God's power must have many restrictions. He cannot directly harm the wishmaker, and he cannot harm creatures of this universe. And it seems as if he cannot use lies and tricks. Otherwise, why would he have told me all that he did? The rules do not permit the use of force or falsehoods. This whole thing sounds very legal and lawyer-like. Although they can't change the rules, they're perfectly happy to use word games and manipulation to get what they want. That is how they trick people, Han Sen thought to himself. Ultimately, he thought it was a good thing that he had come here. He had agreed to make a wish in order to figure out what the wishing process and this god's powers were actually like. Now, he had a much better idea of what was happening. His theories couldn't be 100% accurate, but he was better off now than his previous state of complete cluelessness. To defeat an enemy, you had to understand them. Ignorance was the most frightening thing on a battlefield. Now that Han Sen had agreed to make a wish, he might end up paying a price. But he still thought that this was all worth it. At least he would be able to understand God more. What Han Sen needed to do now was avoid getting tangled in the interest he would owe God upon making a wish. According to the theory he was crafting, the smaller the wish Han Sen made, the smaller the price he would have to pay. That would mean there would be less interest. But Han Sen had no idea what scale he should use to measure wishes. How would he know if the wish he made was big or small? For instance, Han Sen might want $1. That was a small amount. And according to the theory, the wish should accrue very little interest because $1 would be easy to pay back. But God wasn't playing with money here. He He was playing with causal powers. If Han Sen wanted that $1, and that $1 came from a scary elite son, that scary elite son might die. And the responsibility for that would land firmly upon Han Senator at that point. Han Sen would have to face the scary elite's payback. When wishes were fulfilled by causal power, even seemingly small wishes could turn out to be very dangerous. And whatever the price turned out to be, Han Sen would have to pay it. And the final decision would be in hands of that untrustworthy god. Han Sen would have a difficult time trying to navigate around those rules. It is hard fighting God. The 7th team had so many good people, and yet they all ended up the way they did. It looks as if Gu Qingsheng, who didn't make a wish, made the best decision by far, Han Sen thought to himself. I wonder what wish Han Jinji made. How did he avoid the trap set up by God? Han Sen didn't understand. Or at least, he didn't for the moment. But he needed a way to mitigate his risk and make a wish that would cost him the least. There was another thing that Han Sen found extra suspicious. It was the fact that so many of the Extreme King entered the tower, and yet they all ended up okay. Perhaps this god really was a nice loan shark who only ripped people off a little. Han Sen didn't think that was possible, though. All vampires drank blood. After all, what is keeping these Extreme King from having their lives destroyed by these wishes? Han Sen kept walking as he thought, staring at the paintings on the walls along the way. Han Sen thought of many different things he could wish for. He thought of wishing for God to be dead, or for Han Sen himself to become God. Both of those seemed like wishes that God would be unable to fulfill, and thus would be forced to renege on his bargain. But when Han Sen thought about it some more, he realized that those wishes wouldn't work. If Han Sen wished for God to die, he needed a way to make sure that God really was dead. Ordinarily, death meant losing all signs of life. But different types of life also had different types of life signs. When Han Sen first entered the 7th floor and saw the man, he thought the man was dead. If that was the death Han Sen was referring to, then God would fulfill his wish without difficulty. He could make himself lose all signs of life without being negatively impacted. If Han Sen was going to make that sort of wish, he should wish that God had never existed. If God never existed, then he wouldn't be around to fulfill Han Sen's wishes. If he fulfilled Han Sen's wishes, then he wouldn't be around to call in the debt. If he was still around to exact payment, then he could not have fulfilled the wish. It was a simple theory, and the wish should have been impossible to fulfill. The wish made certain assumptions, though. If Han Sen really wished for God to never exist, then the assumption would be that the man really was God. If the man told Han Sen he was not God, it would be as if he was erasing God's existence. And then he could make Han Sen pay the price. There were many other similar methods that God could use to avoid getting the bad end of a bargain. God was very good when it came to toying with rules. Because of that, Han Sen didn't think that any of these ideas would work. Han Sen's gaze came down on the paintings of God hanging on the walls, and suddenly, Han Sen saw them very differently than he had before. The position of the paintings hadn't changed, but looking at them now gave Han Sen a very different sensation. Han Sen felt a water mind coming from one picture. The water mind was like a sea. It washed back and forth over Han Sen, making him feel as if he was drowning in the image. His sensitivity to water powers increased. Han Sen was shocked. He looked at all of the pictures one by one, and he found that each of them had a different meaning. Some of them were very soft and gentle, whereas others were very hard and destructive. Some of them were small, and others were endless. Others were like galaxies hanging in the sky. The 48 pictures somehow captured all the different aspects of water powers. Han Sen looked at the 48 paintings, and his knowledge of water powers increased by several levels. It looks like God's power really is quite impressive. It can read my body composition and place a water mind in the paintings for me. When the Extreme King elites came here, they must have each seen a mind that matched their own powers. That is why they became so much stronger. Frowning, Han Sen muttered to himself, "This god is like King Kun. They both have very strong powers, but for some reason, there are restrictions that keep them from utilizing all of their strength. This is the only chance I have against them, as the ordinary creature that I am. Otherwise, this god could surely destroy the universe itself. But fighting a god by God's rules? The chances of winning are still pretty low." Han Sen then suddenly thought of Azura. Asura left behind the Asura Sutra, or the falsified Sky Sutra, which had causal powers. And Asura had actually consumed a god. Was that god the same type as King Kun? But Han Sen had eventually learned that the god Asura consumed was something like a Buddha. Although the Buddha were strong, they didn't reach god status. Maybe that was just a coincidence, Han Sen thought to himself. Han Sen kept looking at the 48 paintings, all the while thinking about what he might wish for. Gaining more water power was great for Han Sen. Ancient water gods' ancient god origin had caused the original Water King body to develop, so the king area's utility had definitely increased. Learning more through these paintings would also be helpful. But because of his black crystal armor, Han Sen's body was locked down. That god could probably only feel the original Water King body, which was why the paintings only held a water mind. If Han Sen had access to all his Geno arts, he could have learned a great deal more from the paintings. But the black crystal armor wasn't giving Han Sen the opportunity to do that, and Han Sen couldn't understand why. It was similar to how the black crystal armor had hidden from the Geno Hall. A month was a long time, though. Han Sen was able to think about all this slowly, as he had plenty of time to learn the water mines that were available. With his own water mine knowledge deepening, Han Sen's water element shocking Sky Punch became stronger. As he understood more and more, Han Sen continued to modify the technique. Han Sen hadn't yet made a wish. This was the last day he would be allowed to remain inside the tower, and he was still learning the water mines and the paintings. The painting in front of Han Sen started to talk. "You made a deal with me. You must make a wish. If you don't, you cannot be allowed to leave Destiny's tower. And you know this." Han Sen laughed and said, "I am going to make the wish now." God was threatening Han Senator if Han Sen didn't keep his promise. He wouldn't be allowed out even if the Extreme King opened Destiny's tower. But Han Sen thought this threat was very interesting. It seemed that, for some reason, God didn't want to offend the Extreme King. Otherwise, he would have just let Han Sen reach the time limit without reminding him. That proved that God was planning to let Han Sen go instead of forcing him to stay. "Then come to me and tell me your wish," the man said in a cool voice. His face remained impassive. Han Sen returned to the 7th floor of Destiny's tower and walked in front of the man. "You do not have much time. Tell me your wish," the man said. "Can you fulfill any wish I want?" Han Sen asked, looking at the man. "Yes, anything you want," the man surely said. "Can I look for someone?" Han Sen asked. "Of course." The man was answering without hesitation. He must have heard many strange wishes in his time. Looking for someone might have been a very common wish. "Good. Then, can you please tell me where my great-granddad is?" Han Sen didn't make a tricky wish or try to trap God. His wish was simple. When the man heard it, he thought the wish was very simple as well. He wouldn't have to bend the rules to fulfill this request. "What is your great-grandfather's name?" the man asked. "Aren't you God? You must know." Han Sen said with a chuckle. "Fine," the man said casually. He looked at Han Sen, but the reflection in his eyes kept changing. Han Sen made this wish because he wanted to know which great-granddad Han Jinji actually was. If Han Jinji had been an ordinary man, then he would have already died and left the world. In that case, God wouldn't be able to find out where he was. At most, God would track him back to a gravesite. If Han Sen's great-granddad was actually the legendary figure he'd been told about, then Han Jinji had already escaped the powers of a god once. He must have been really powerful himself. This man who called himself God should have had a hard time finding someone like that. Somewhere in the universe, on a planet, in a certain street, a fortune teller was sitting on the road. He was eating noodles, making loud slurping noises as he sucked them down. Suddenly, the fortune teller's face changed. He accidentally dropped the noodles onto the ground as he shouted, "Who is tricking me?" The fortune teller's fingers twitched for a second. When he spoke again, his voice sounded furious. "That traitorous B***** tricked me." While he was talking, the fortune teller quickly pulled something out of his bag. He bit his middle finger and let a drop of blood fall onto the item. He mumbled, "What a shame. Getting this treasure took so much work. When I go back, I'm going to teach that little B**** a lesson." A fox was walking down the road, and she saw the fortune teller holding an article of underwear decorated with flowers. He looked as if he was in pain. She stared at him, but the fortune teller didn't even seem to notice. His face remained twisted in discomfort. In Destiny's Tower, the man looked at Han Sen. The images reflected in his eyes kept changing, but all of them gleamed brightly. Han Sen had made a wish. When the wish was complete, the man could use his power on Han Sen. Tracing Han Sen's bloodline would be very easy, as it was just a basic power. It didn't even require any special tricks. As the spell ran, the man considered different ways he could maximize his earnings from someone making such a wish. While he was in thought, the image in the man's eyes kept changing. The gleam of power in those eyes was constant, but the images within them began to whirl faster and faster. "Arg!" the man suddenly screamed. He covered his godly-looking eyes. Han Sen frowned and looked at the man. He didn't know what had happened. While he was wondering, he suddenly heard a pang. That man's eyes exploded, leaving behind two black holes. From the empty air of the room around them, a godlike voice laughed darkly. "How dare you spy on me? This time, I'm only taking away your eyes. Next time, I will destroy your body." "No, impossible. How could you be his heir?" "That is impossible," screamed the man whose eyes had been incinerated. "Whose heir?" Han Sen asked the man. Now he could see the wounds clearly. The holes in the man's eyes weren't flesh. They were rimmed with a jade-like substance. His eyes were completely destroyed, and there wasn't a single drop of blood. The eyeless man looked creepy. The empty pits stared at Han Sen as the man gnashed his teeth. "It doesn't matter if you are his heir or not. You made a wish, and so, you must pay the price. Plus, there is no way you are his heir." "You haven't told me where he is," Han Sen said. "He is where he should be," the man said sternly. "This is wrong. You have broken the rules." Han Sen frowned. "The rules are simple. I have done what you asked, and so, you must pay up." The man looked quite angry. "What if I don't pay up?" Han Sen asked, glaring at the man. "That isn't up to you," the man laughed in a grating voice. A light began to shine around his body, like the aura of some ancient sky god. Han Sen's face suddenly changed. He noticed his lifespan had been drastically reduced. Normal creatures in the Geno universe couldn't detect their own lifespan, but Han Sen had come from the sanctuaries. He could see his own lifespan. Han Sen's maximum lifespan was reducing, year by year. It was transforming into a barely visible light and drifting toward the man. "If this place wasn't Destiny's Tower, you would be giving me more than just years from your lifespan for destroying my eyes," the man seethed. "That was unlucky. I made a wish and received nothing. And on top of that, my lifespan is being stolen. These so-called gods are quite fickle." Han Sen was furious, and he had to act. He couldn't allow himself to lose any more years. He had already lost a dozen years, and the man was still sapping away even more. Han Sen didn't know how much lifespan the man planned on taking in payment for this wish. But now Han Sen understood why the Extreme King didn't complain about the consequences of their wishes. A part of their lifespan was probably taken away, but unlike Han Sen, they had no way of knowing what was happening. Even if they did notice that something was different, they wouldn't know how much of their lifespan had been stolen. As his lifespan drained away, Han Sen felt something powerful activate inside his Sea of Soul. That black crystal armor hanging in his Sea of Soul suddenly moved. Without Han Sen summoning, the black crystal armor appeared and floated in front of Han Sen. That black set of armor looked as if it could absorb all light. It made those who looked at it feel as if they were in the deepest recesses of hell. Han Sen froze as he looked upon the black crystal armor. The moment the armor floated in front of him, his lifespan had stopped decreasing. His connection with the man had been severed as decisively as if it had been snipped with a pair of scissors. Han Sen stopped losing years. "What is going on? I've only taken a dozen years, but it should have been 153 years. Why is this happening?" The man didn't seem to notice the presence of the black crystal armor. He looked very confused. He turned his eyeless sockets back to Han Sen. The empty pits that were once eyes stared at Han Sen. He obviously wasn't adjusting well to his new handicap. The black crystal armor, floating in front of Han Sen, lifted its gauntlet arm. In that moment, it looked more like a real person than an empty set of armor. It raised its hand and made a fist. The black crystal armor walked up to the man, but he didn't seem to notice it. When the black crystal armor stepped in front of the man, the clenched fist suddenly launched in a savage punch. Boom! The man's body exploded. He was like a rock being reduced to powder in an instant. Beneath the power of that fist, he was nothing more than dust on the wind. The man who had called himself God was blown up in a single punch. An iridescent power that Han Sen could barely see rose from the exploded body. Then it drifted into Han Sen. Lifespan +1. Lifespan +1. Han Sen's lifespan began to shoot upward. In seconds, he had earned an additional 100 years. He was gaining lifespan much faster than he had lost it, and the process was still accelerating. 200 years, 300 years, 500 years. Han Sen watched his own lifespan increase, and as he did, his heart began to pound. He felt as if it was going to jump out of his chest. Once every drop of that strange power had drifted into Han Sen's body, his lifespan reached 1787. In less than a minute, his lifespan had increased by half a millennium. I wonder how many years he has taken from the Extreme King. This cannot be all, surely. Han Sen asked the black crystal armor, directing a greedy stare at where the man's body had been. The black crystal armor ignored him. It turned around and returned to his Sea of Soul. Just like before, it hung in a corner of the Sea of Soul without moving an inch. The moment the guy that called himself God was destroyed, far away, in a mysterious palace, a man frowned and said, "Empty God. Even if my god doll offended you, you could have just taken his eyes. Instead, you actually killed him. Do you think I am afraid of you?" In the streets, the fortune teller looked at the broken article of underwear in his hand, then let it go. It was reduced to dust. He sighed and said, "What a shame. It was hard to get my hands on that item." He picked up his bowl of noodles that had fallen to the ground and wiped the bowl clean with a cloth. Then, he put the bowl away. Picking up his sign, which read, "Destiny," he walked down the street and disappeared amidst the crowds. Han Sen watched the man turn to dust, and as he did, he realized that his time was up. He quickly ran down through the tower. As he ran, he thought to himself, "If the Extreme King finds out the statue is destroyed, they won't come after me, will they? I won't admit I was the one to destroy it, but even if I said I did, they wouldn't believe I was able to, would they?" When Han Sen reached the 6th floor, he saw that the paintings were still hanging on the walls. But the meaning and influence behind them had disappeared. They were just ordinary paintings now. It was like this all the way down. All of the paintings had lost their god minds. They were nothing special anymore. Weird. Fox Queen said the 9-spin destiny mirror was inside this tower. How come I haven't seen it? With that thought, Han Sen checked the time and realized that he still had 1 hour left. So, he decided to look around the tower. He had walked up and down the tower many times over the past month. Aside from the paintings, the man had been the only other thing there. There were no mirrors. Was Fox Queen lying to me? That doesn't make any sense. Lying to me about the mirror wouldn't benefit her in any way. Han Sen frowned and thought to himself, did someone manage to trick Fox Queen herself? Maybe give her bogus intel? If that is the case, then that might mean Fox Queen's identity has been exposed. But Fox Queen is smart. Tricking someone like her would be difficult. Han Sen was both intrigued and a little worried. So he looked into every corner of Destiny's tower with complete thoroughness. There was no 9-spin destiny mirror. There was nothing inside the tower at all. Han Sen could see each floor clearly with just a look. If there was a mirror, he would have seen it. Searching should have been unnecessary. There isn't anywhere to hide things in this tower. Aside from the statue man that looked like a human but wasn't actually a human, that is, Han Sen suddenly thought of the man who had been sitting atop that pedestal. He returned to the 7th floor. If something was hidden anywhere in this tower, it had to be inside that pedestal. Han Sen hadn't returned to the 7th floor in order to help Fox Queen, though. If there really was a treasure like the 9-spin destiny mirror, he would take it for himself. After all, the 9-spin destiny mirror would be a powerful item. The Foxes thought that regaining the item would let them take back a prominent place in the universe. Back on the 7th floor, Han Sen looked at the platform the man had been sitting upon. It was just an ordinary stone pedestal. There was nothing special about it. It was made of the same stone that composed the rest of Destiny's Tower. Han Sen reached out his hands and pressed against the pedestal. The platform had taken no damage at all. It clearly wasn't something that would break easily. It's a shame that I used all my 9-spin fox power. Otherwise, I could try to use that power to summon the mirror. Han Sen went silent for a moment, then extended one of his fingers over the stone. He allowed a droplet of blood to fall down onto the pedestal. That blood was infused with the power of the Blood Pulse Sutra. Han Sen wanted to see if the platform was spiritual in some capacity. When the blood splashed onto the stone, the platform began to shake. The blood then blended into the pedestal, and it shook even harder. Suddenly, the platform floated up into the air. It hovered, its stone enamel cracking and flaking off from the violent tremoring. Soon, the real face of the pedestal began to be revealed. A while later, the stone surface shattered completely, revealing the stone mirror inside. When Han Sen let another droplet of blood bleed onto the stone mirror, silver light glowed from the mirror. Within the reflective surface, Han Sen saw the shadow of a silver 9-tailed fox. Those 9 tails swayed softly as the small fox eyes regarded Han Sen. Buzz! The stone mirror started to fly. Spinning around Han Sen, the stone mirror was the size of a mortar and pestle, but it shrank until it was around the size of Han Sen's hand. It landed in his palm, and then the light completely disappeared. The shadow of the 9-tailed fox in the mirror was gone. Han Sen lifted the mirror, and he realized that it no longer reflected anything. It was just a piece of grayish-white stone. Even if he tried to polish it with a soft fabric, the mirror refused to show a reflection. But on the back of the stone mirror, Han Sen found an engraving of the 9-tailed fox. It was just like the shadow Han Sen had seen when the mirror was glowing. The droplet of blood had vanished. It seemed to have disappeared when the stone mirror activated. Han Sen played with the stone mirror for a while, but he was unable to find out how to use it. He couldn't activate the stone mirror's power. I can try to use my blood to gain control of it. Maybe it will come to recognize me like the J-drum did. Han Sen put away the stone mirror and waited until the departure time was upon him. When that time rolled around, Destiny's Tower opened. Quickly, he rushed out of there. The Extreme King didn't seem to know anything about what had transpired inside Destiny's Tower, which made him feel very relieved. He said his goodbyes and returned to Planet Waterzone's underwater town. If you were that powerful, you should have just done it sooner. If something like that happens again, you don't need to wait around before cutting the bad guy down. Kill a few more gods, and we'll live a lot longer, Han Sen said to the black crystal armor in his Sea of Soul once he had returned to his room. But the black crystal armor didn't move. It behaved as it always did, like a dead object. When the black crystal armor didn't react, Han Sen left it alone. He rested at home for a few more days, waiting to see if the Extreme King noticed any changes in Destiny's Tower. Luckily, the Extreme King was none the wise. They didn't seem to have a clue that the man statue inside Destiny's Tower had been destroyed. It made Han Sen feel much safer. Han Sen, Super God Spirit Body, Geno Battle Body, Mutant Blood, Duke, Spell, Duke, Dongxian, King, Jade Skin, Duke, Level, King, King Genes, 22, Deified Progress, 12%, Lifespan, 1,787. He isn't dead? Upon learning that Han Sen was alive and had visited Destiny's Tower, Fox Queen was amazed. Fox Queen wanted to go to Planet Waterzone immediately to see if Han Sen had managed to get the 9-spin Destiny Mirror from Destiny's Tower. But Bai Songlong had something he needed her to do, so she didn't have time to go to Planet Waterzone yet. In order to protect her cover identity, she had to suppress her impatience for the time being. But Fox Queen couldn't stop thinking about how Han Sen had activated the sacred blood statue, yet somehow managed to survive. She couldn't figure out how he had pulled that off. Long ago, Sacred Leader used the sacred blood statue to control subordinates. Even his deified soldiers were subject to it. And the sacred blood statue on Han Sen's back had been drawn in ancient blood dragon lady's blood. That sort of sacred blood statue was reserved for use against deifieds. Han Sen was just a duke. He wasn't even a king yet, so how could he survive? Fox Queen was very confused. but it would be a while before she could travel to Planet Water Zone and find answers to her questions. After Han Sen returned to Underwater Town, he began researching the 9-spin Destiny Mirror. He couldn't discover anything unique about it. He put power into it, but he couldn't seem to activate the item. His only option was to drip his blood onto the stone mirror in the hope that it would come to acknowledge him as its master further down the line. Every time Han Sen placed his blood upon the stone mirror, it would light up with the shadow of the 9-tailed fox. When the shadow disappeared, the blood would go with it. Han Sen was trying to use the same method he had with the jade drum, but it didn't seem to be working. Did King Bao put the fox's 9-spin Destiny Mirror in Destiny's Tower and place it beneath that statue? If so, why would he do that? Han Sen couldn't come up with any answers to that question. The stone mirror wasn't making any progress, and for the moment, there didn't seem to be anything Han Sen could do about that. The water fairy in the jade gourd was helping Han Sen grow stronger, though. She embodied the feelings of the proud bone's sword mind for him, and as a result, Han Sen felt as if his own sword mind was about to have a breakthrough. Han Sen didn't copy Mad Sword's sword mind, though. He used his own sword mind to fight with Mad Sword's. At first, the fights were entirely one-sided, but after a while, Han Sen started to develop some resistance. Mad Sword's sword mind wasn't suitable for Han Sen, so he didn't plan on using it directly. Instead, he used it as a grinding stone, sharpening his own sword mind against it. It doesn't matter how strong Mad Sword's sword mind is. It isn't my own. It would only belong to me if I could fully understand it. Although improvements like this were much slower than if he were to simply copy Mad Sword's sword mind, Han Sen wasn't in any particular rush. He focused on each aspect of his sword mind, improving it a piece at a time. Although Han Sen had many King-class core genes, and he had 100 King-class xenogeneic genes, he would need many more in the coming days. So, Han Sen still planned on going back to the core area to hunt for more core genes. It was always good to have more in the shed, after all. If Han Sen's guess was correct, 100 King-class xenogeneic genes might raise his King area by 1 tier. Han Sen pushed his self-cogwheel to enter the core area again. He returned to the location where he had left, which wasn't too far from Planet Dark Zone. Han Sen wouldn't dare visit Planet Dark Zone again until he had enough strength. Provoking that weird insect would basically mean committing suicide. His super god body didn't make him invincible, and the time limit was always a headache. Once I become deified, will I be able to use an infinite amount of super god spirit body? Han Sen wondered as he flew. What a coincidence. Are you interested in cooperating again? Han Sen hadn't been flying for long when a group of people approached him. It was Dragon 1, Dragon 8, and some other dragons. But Dragon 1 and Dragon 8 were the only dragons who had survived their last venture. The dragons accompanying them now were new. Han Sen didn't answer. From another direction, a second group of people was swiftly approaching. The leader of that bunch was Diarabber. As he flew closer, he said, "If you guys are cooperating, might it be okay if we join?" Han Sen was shocked. He had only just entered the core area, and these two had already found him. This couldn't be a coincidence. "People, I am flattered, but I was hoping to venture out alone this time. Maybe another time?" Han Sen said, rejecting their offers politely. He didn't know what they were after, and he didn't want to fight with them. Han Sen turned to leave, but Diarabber immediately said, "If you don't wish to work with us, that's fine. But I have a few mutant King-class xenogeneics to go after. Are you interested in taking a look?" Han Sen stopped. It took time to find mutant xenogeneics, so being able to travel straight to them would be a great help for Han Sen's leveling. If they were killing mutants, Han Sen could gain the xenogeneics' talents without needing to practice them. Not bad, not bad. I have a lead on a few mutant xenogeneics as well. If you're interested, you know the rules and shares, Dragon 1 then said. Han Sen was very tempted by both offers. If things really were as they said, killing a few mutant xenogeneics would be very beneficial for Han Senator Plus. He would be getting 50% of the spoils from the entire fight, not just what he personally killed. And there would be no need to spend time seeking the xenogeneics out. Opportunities like this were hard to come by. After a brief period of silent thought, Han Sen still turned down both offers. If he chose a side now, he would only end up offending the other. Han Sen wasn't worried about offending others, but in this case, it was unnecessary. Since Han Sen hadn't agreed, they still wouldn't be able to kill those mutant xenogeneics by themselves. They would need Han Sen's help in the future, anyway. Perhaps he could receive more benefits like this later on. Dragon One and Diarabber seemed to expect Han Sen to turn them down, so they didn't appear to be disappointed. They still spoke to Han Sen with glee and respect, hoping they could cooperate again in the near future. Why are you so nice to him? Do you think the destroyed need a king like him? Bar asked once Han Sen had left. Diarabber was one of the few people that could make Bar listen. If Diarabber wasn't there, he would have fought Han Senator. It wasn't that Bar didn't like Han Sen. He just enjoyed fighting powerful people. Diarabber nodded with sincerity, and he said, "Yes, we really need someone like him." Seeing Bar fall silent, Diarabber sighed and said, "We need him because he is stronger than us. Sure, the deified members of our race are stronger than he is, but that matters little because they can't enter the core area. If they cannot come, then they cannot come. What's the big deal?" Bar grunted in annoyance. Diarabber smiled and said, "There is no big deal. But if we want to kill deified core xenogeneics in the core area, then we need him. Do you think our destroyed kings could escape a deified xenogeneic the way Dollar did? If they didn't have an area power to restrict strength, an ordinary deified xenogeneic couldn't kill me," Bar said. "You are the best king we have, but hunting deified xenogeneics with just you and I would be an impossible task. We might succeed, but we would sacrifice a lot. With Dollar's help, that can change. The success rate would be higher, and we wouldn't sacrifice as much. What is the harm in that?" Diarabber asked, shaking his head. Almost word for word, Dragon One said the same thing to the Dragon Kings. Han Sen didn't know what they were planning, and neither did he want to know. He flew through space for around an hour before he found a lone core xenogeneic flying through the darkness. That xenogeneic looked very unusual. It hung against the empty background of space like a burning smithy's furnace. Its body looked to be made of steel, and its cogwheel-composed body was wrapped with countless chains. A fiery red core glowed on its top. Han Sen flew right up to the big furnace, but before he became within range, the furnace's opening shot a geyser of fire at him. It looked like a volcano erupting. The enormous wave of flame spread as it came forward, and in 1 second, a few dozen miles were covered in that raging blaze. Han Sen felt as if his body was going to melt. Without hesitation, he summoned the purple and red laser gun and sent his power into it. He fired it at the big furnace. The laser gun unleashed a beam of red and purple light. The purple and red light shot right through the fire area and struck the big furnace without even slowing down. Pang! The furnace's body was 10 meters wide. Han Sen's beam of light punched through the furnace, then spread out from the puncture wound to consume the entire creature. The core demon bug gun has a consuming power. Not bad. Not bad at all. The only frustrating thing is that the consuming power works slowly, and the radius isn't as large as the original creature's consuming area. Han Sen quite liked his new gun. The big furnace heaved out fire as it turned to run, but it was full of holes after Han Sen riddled it with a few more shots. In the end, the creature exploded. The fire within the furnace went off like a firework as the creature detonated. Core xenogeneic king hunted. Smithy furnace. Core xenogeneic gene found. Han Sen flew around and grabbed the red claw that had fallen out of the creature. He placed the claw in his pocket and flew forward to find other things to slay. After flying for another half an hour or so, Han Sen found another one of those furnaces. He rushed over and blew the furnace up, receiving another core xenogeneic gene for his trouble. This part of the core area seemed like a space dedicated to the furnaces. After 10 hours of soaring, Han Sen had managed to kill a total of 6 furnaces. Although none of them gave him a beast soul, the mere ability to harvest xenogeneic genes was pleasing to Han Sen. At this rate, I will become very rich. Han Sen was very happy with the progress he had made thus far, and so he continued to fly forward. After another short while of travel, he found a place populated by many asteroids. He saw another flying furnace, too. As Han Sen looked closer, he noticed that this furnace was different from all the other furnaces he had thus far encountered. The other furnaces were around a dozen meters tall, and they were made of a featureless black steel. This furnace was only 3 or 4 meters tall, however. It was made of copper, and the core of the furnace and the fires inside were bronze. The weirdest thing about this one, though, was that there was a sword sticking out of it. That sword was almost wholly swallowed by the flames. It was very red, and something about it was particularly eye-catching. Is this another subspecies of the flying furnaces? There is a sword inside. This looks higher class than those black furnaces, but the power I sense from it doesn't seem to be much stronger. The other furnaces were kings of the first or second tier. But this guy has an area that is at the third or fourth tier at the most. Han Sen had come to kill Xenogeneics, so he didn't put any more thought into it. He pulled out his gun and fired more of his red and purple beams at the furnace. That furnace was sitting atop a giant asteroid. It was breathing, inhaling some sort of power from the universe. Every breath made the fire burn bright and hot. Han Sen's red and purple beam of light landed on the copper furnace, blowing a big chunk blown out of the creature. The copper furnace tumbled away from its position, bouncing off other asteroids as it went. The copper flame of the furnace also struck the asteroids, leaving behind trails of scorching fire. Han Sen was shocked. The core demon bug gun was a mutant king bee soul, but the shot was unable to cut all the way through the copper furnace. The beam of light had only dented the creature's surface, and the consuming powers weren't able to latch on. The copper furnace righted itself before long, and it looked very angry. It spat out a long geyser of fire, venting its rage like some flaming demon. Han Sen didn't feel sorry for the creature, though. He just fired his gun at it again. On the inside, he was thinking, I need to strike as quickly as I can. The body of this copper furnace is nothing weak, but if I shoot it a few more times, I should be able to break it. The purple and red beam flew toward the furnace again, but the furnace released a red light that intercepted the beam. It looked like the burning red light had come from the sword inside the furnace. Pang! 2 powers hit each other, and the collision produced a beautiful shower of sparks. Then, to Han Sen's surprise, sparks began to spill from the sword inside the furnace. The sword didn't break, though. The beam from the core demon bug gun was dispersed by the impact, and it spread harmlessly into the reaches of space. The sword inside the furnace made sizzling noises. The fire inside the copper furnace popped and crackled like it was talking to the sword. A copper-colored flame area covered the entire galaxy, wrapping over both Han Sen and the furnace. But Han Sen couldn't feel the heat. It was like the copper flame area was some sort of mirage. The copper flame area intensified, and the sword grew hotter and hotter. It turned to translucent gold, and strange symbols appeared across its length. Han Sen felt fear awaken inside him. He quickly raised and fired his gun a few more times. But the sword flew and danced, hitting every single projectile with its sword lights. The copper fire area was still present, and the sword continued to absorb it. The body of the golden sword became a green crystal, and it burned with a copper fire. It looked both pretty and disturbing. Han Sen frowned. The sword seemed so powerful enough to frighten him. This is a strong Xenogeneic. It is just 3rd or 4th tier, but its area power is boosting the sword inside the furnace to unbelievable levels. The sword's power is at least half deified by this point. This is amazing. Han Sen was shocked, but he didn't want to back off now. He summoned Move Mountain Area, curious to see just how strong this special furnace Xenogeneic really was. The crystal sword was burning with a copper fire. The sword groaned as it broke the sky. It was teleporting toward Han Sen's heart. Han Sen aimed a punch at the flying sword. His armor was imbued with Move Mountain Area, so his defense would be very strong. Han Sen didn't have to be scared of the power wielded by the sword. Pang! The tip of the sword thudded into Han Sen's fist. The sword carved a deep gash in the armored fist, and blood began to drip out. A very powerful sword. Han Sen lowered his head and stared at his fist. Despite being imbued with Move Mountain Area, the armor covering his fist had been sliced clean through. His fingers were bleeding. He was just thankful that the bones were undamaged. The sword from the furnace came to strike a second time, but this strike was going to be harder than the last one. The sword moved so fast that Han Sen could barely follow it with his eyes. Catcha! Han Sen grabbed the blade of the sword from the furnace, which drew more streams of blood from his hands. He kept gripping the blade, though. The sword from the furnace shook as if it was trying to move forward, but Han Sen held on tight and kept the blade still. The copper furnace's fire blazed higher. The fire area covered everything again. The sword from the furnace absorbed that fire, and the sword grew even more transparent. Its power increased, and it thrust toward Han Sen's heart again. The blade sliced deeper into Han Sen's hands. Blood spilled around the sharp edges of the sword, but even still, Han Sen refused to let go. He resettled his grip on the sword, tightening his hands as he tried to force back the sword from the furnace. The tip of the sword from the furnace almost touched Han Sen's chest. The green crystal blade looked like a venomous snake as it shook and writhed in Han Sen's hands. It was trying to strike at his heart, but its movements had been restricted. The copper furnace was rising, drawing in energy from the galaxy all around it as it went. The fire burned higher and hotter. The bronze fire area encompassed everything again. The sword from the furnace absorbed a fire area, and it received a godly boost of power. It unleashed a level of strength that was hard to imagine. It slid forward through Han Sen's hands, unstoppable. Catcha! The sword began slicing through the armor on Han Sen's chest. He kept trying to push the fierce blade back, but he couldn't. Blood was now pouring from Han Sen's hands, and it was only a matter of time before it started cutting into his finger bones. The blade had sunk 5 centimeters into Han Sen's chest at this point, and it was about to touch his heart. The copper furnace was dancing happily. The fire within it was doing a jig, and the flames took on the shape of a smiling emoji that stared right at Han Sen. "You are really strong, but this has got to stop," Han Sen said to the copper furnace, his hand still holding the blade. The sword from the furnace was very strong, but after those first few attacks, the scary power had moved into the Dongxian armor. It wouldn't be as easy for the sword from the furnace to pierce through the Dongxian armor now. Catcha! Han Sen summoned his strength and pushed against the sword from the furnace. His grip on the blade should have been tenuous at best, but no matter how much the sword tried to struggle, it couldn't break free from Han Sen's clasp. The copper furnace's fire blazed furiously again and released another fire area. The fire area wasn't dangerous by itself, but it buffed the sword from the furnace an alarming amount. Every time the fire area appeared, it made the sword from the furnace much stronger, and that buffing capability appeared to be limitless. Because the sword from the furnace grew stronger every time, that meant that the area effect was stackable. This stackable area was the first Han Sen had seen. Han Sen's eyes hardened as he grabbed the sword from the furnace. He pulled the sword out of his chest as the fire area suddenly disappeared. Aside from the small fire that still flickered within the copper furnace, there were no other sparks. Han Sen had been running his Dongxian area at max power. It forced the copper furnace's universal self-cogwheel to stop, extinguishing the fire area. The copper furnace was shivering. The cogwheels inside the furnace were spinning very quickly, trying to draw enough energy from the space around it to fuel the fire area again. But no matter how fast they spun, the creature couldn't ignore its area power. It was like trying to strike a wet match. Unless the opponent was stronger than Han Sen, the Dongxian area would force them to use their universal self-cogwheel. If they didn't, they would have no power inside the Dongxian area. The copper furnace itself wasn't too strong. It was just a second or third tier King Xenogeneic. But its fire area, when used in concert with the sword from the furnace, had incredible power. After a few buffs, the sword from the furnace was at least as good as a half-deified being. This was the first time Han Sen had seen this type of Xenogeneic. The copper furnace wanted to spit out some more fire, but no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't even generate a plume of smoke. "It's my turn now." Holding the sword from the furnace in one hand, Han Sen lifted his core demon bug gun in the other. He fired at the copper furnace like a madman. Because of the Move Mountain area, Han Sen's movement speed was slow. There was no way that he could have attacked the copper furnace by hand at this point, but the core demon bug gun's firing speed was unchanged. Pang, 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 pang. The purple and red beam crashed into the copper furnace, and the creature was sent flying. The furnace collected dents all over its surface as it bounced through the asteroid field. Why is this guy so hard? Han Sen was stunned. He had used his core demon bug gun to shoot at it for ages. He covered the copper furnace with dents and dings, but he was unable to break it, and the consuming power couldn't latch onto his enemy. The copper furnace looked to be in bad shape, but it had only taken minor injuries. It hadn't sustained any serious harm. A third or fourth tier king's enigenic has such a weird area, and its body is so hard. This is very strange. Han Sen frowned, but Han Sen had come too far to let things go now. He kept using his core demon bug gun to shoot at the copper furnace, resolving to shoot the thing as much as he needed to in order to break it. Han Sen's precise shots continued nailing the furnace. The creature was still flying, but rather than trying to get away from Han Sen, it was coming closer. The furnace jerked forward like it was riding a roller coaster in space. The sword from the furnace kept struggling within Han Sen's hand, but it couldn't shake him loose. Pang! Finally, after Han Sen had been shooting for what seemed like forever, one side of the copper furnace took a little too much damage. The purple and red light blew a fist-sized hole in the surface. The hole wasn't large, but Han Sen felt instantly relieved. The size wasn't a problem. If he could pierce it, then he could destroy it. Han Sen planned to keep on firing, but the copper furnace began to make wheezing, crying sounds. The Dongxian area was still locking down all the cogwheels in the nearby space, and no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't create any more fire areas. Suddenly, Han Sen heard a deafening metallic shriek. This sound wasn't coming from the copper furnace, though. Han Sen raised his head. He turned and saw a giant copper furnace coming toward him. It was as big as a planet, and thousands of swords circled it like a raging river. Every sword looked like the sword from the furnace in Han Sen's hand. They burned with a weird green fire that looked somehow crystalline. As far as Han Sen could see, the galaxy was covered in a stream of swords, and the world became a sea of flashing blades. The huge furnace's appearance caught Han Sen completely off guard. He quickly shoved as much power as possible into his Dongxian area. It was impossible for him to completely stop the swords from the furnace and the fire area. This giant copper furnace was a genuine half-deified beast. It was probably only one small step away from being deified. It was almost stronger than Dragon One, but, thankfully, it didn't have substance chains, so it couldn't be a real deified. The Dongxian area couldn't completely seal power, but it still affected the universal cogwheels. It made the universal cogwheels spin slower, which led to a reduction in power. Plus, with the Move Mountain area, Han Sen wasn't really afraid of that stream of swords, though they did look very scary. Dong! Han Sen waved the sword from the furnace that was in his hand and knocked away a bunch of the raining swords that were coming dangerously close. But ultimately, the sword rain was too much to defend against, and each one of those swords wielded a frightening power. Each attack came with the strength of a half-deified creature. A blade hit Han Sen, cutting open the Dongxian armor. Fortunately, Move Mountain area was able to absorb a lot of power from the attacks it had sustained. It was able to shrug off the attack of a half-deified being. The sword rain could leave deep scratches in the Dongxian armor, but it couldn't pierce all the way through. Blade after blade slammed into the armor. It was like a flash flood. Each one kept left a scrape across the armor's surface. The strikes got dangerously close to Han Sen's flesh, and he almost yelled out in alarm. The waterfall of swords kept pounding Han Sen's body. Under such violent attacks, this king seemed just as threatening as a deified Xenogeniac. While the deified bug Han Sen had fought was incredibly powerful, it didn't have any ranged attacks, so the kings with Han Sen still had a chance to run away. But beneath this sword rain that blanketed the sky, there was nowhere to run. No matter how strong a person's defenses were, getting continuously struck by that sword waterfall would eventually lead to him getting perforated. It was the same principle Han Sen had been counting on when he attacked the copper furnace. But this stream of attacks wasn't made up of water. It was composed of swords wielding half-deified power. If it was anyone else, with any different type of area power, they would have died within the first messy barrage of that stream of swords. Even their bones would have been crushed. Luckily, Han Sen had his Move Mountain area for protection. As all those sword streams came down on the Dongxian armor, they provided an incredible buff to the armor's defensive properties. As long as the first few attacks didn't break the Move Mountain area, using the Dongxian armor as the carrier made him invincible. The small copper furnace flew over to the big copper furnace. The mouth of the furnace kept spitting out fire as it made a pitiful whining noise. It seemed to be telling the big copper furnace of its woes. After the big copper furnace heard what it was told, it became enraged. It released a wave of green fire that looked like it could incinerate a planet. The fire area came down and covered the swords from the furnaces. The swords received the fire area's buff, and their powers rose to a terrifying level. Dragon One was flying through space. After Robber left, he went around, following in the direction Han Sen had gone. He kept on the move, but he didn't see Han Sen. Han Sen had been traveling fast, clearly intending to kill as many xenogeneics as possible. Dragon One and Robber had talked for a while before going their separate ways. It made sense that Dragon One had yet to catch up with Han Sen. Moving forward more leads to the core furnace zone. The strongest core furnace is halfway to being deified. It doesn't have its own substance chain yet, but it is stronger than most half-deified beings. And there are scary swords inside that furnace. Many kings and half-deifieds have confronted it, but none of them have been able to kill it. I wonder why Dollar is headed there. Is he going to fight the core furnace alone? Dragon One looked forward and frowned. He was still traveling forward, but he suddenly glanced over his shoulder. He saw a shadow coming toward him. Dragon One watched it suspiciously, and when he saw the person clearly, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. Robber? What a coincidence. We meet again so soon. Robber smiled and flew towards Dragon One, stopping right before him. Dragon One and Robber looked at each other. They were both smart, so they both knew what the other wanted. Robber, if you quit now, we will leave Exquisite Mountain. It will belong to you, and the other destroyed, Dragon One offered quietly. Robber laughed. Dragon One, give me $. We do not want Exquisite Mountain. The dragon can keep it. It looks like we will have to employ our own tricks, Dragon One said with a feral grin. No matter what, $. Will belong to the destroyed, Robber responded coldly. Even if that is what you want, he might not go with you, Dragon One countered. Robber started to say something, but then he noticed some green flames far in the distance. The light reflected off of clouds of dust that had risen from the turmoil, and countless swords could be seen flying against the dusty backdrop. $. Went to the core furnaces? Robber's face changed. Dragon One frowned. It seems that way. Robber's face changed, but in the end, he laughed and looked at Dragon One. He said, he really dares to go in there? Does he want to kill the core furnace? Not bad. Now we can gauge how strong he is. You will want to know as well, right? Dragon One had a wry smile. He and Robber were thinking the same thing. They both wanted to use $'s powers to fight the core area's deified xenogeneics. The core area's deified xenogeneics were a very large prize. Because no deified could enter this place, claiming that prize was a very difficult process. Many different elites of varying races had attempted to bring down core deifieds, but they all had failed. Even the extreme king had to rally many half-deified people to pull off such a hunt. The dragon and the destroyed had achieved some modicum of success in the past, but they had to rally many half-deifieds in their attempts. That also meant they lost a lot of people in the battles, and when the benefits were split among those who remained, there was never much for each person. Nothing to compensate for the danger and losses incurred. Therefore, over the past few years, there hadn't been many chances to hunt deified xenogeneics. The strength of deified xenogeneics varied widely, and the weaker variety were generally targeted by hunters. Once those deified xenogeneics were killed, only the strong deified xenogeneics remained, and over time, those monsters became even stronger. Killing them was now a much harder endeavor than it had once been. Like the weird bug they recently encountered, it was a powerful deified xenogeneic. Even if they gathered many half-deified elites, there'd be a very low chance of actually taking out that horrifying creature.